The sun bled gold across the vast, bruised canvas of the juniper flats. It was a weary, late afternoon light that offered no real warmth, only a long and melancholic illumination of the land's hardships. It caught the dust kicked up by a relentless wind, turning the air into a shimmering haze of grit and pollen. Tumbleweeds, skeletal and brittle, cartwheeled across the cracked earth, their dry scraping the only sound for miles, a lonesome whisper in the immense silence. This was a place that drank light and gave back nothing but heat and distance. Through this unforgiving landscape, a figure moved with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who had walked past the point of exhaustion and now operated on memory alone. Cora Linden was a slip of a woman, made thinner by hunger and fear, her form a slight disruption in the horizontal sweep of the plains. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the ground a few feet ahead, as if plotting a course through a minefield. The gate to the ranch, a simple construction of weathered timber, seemed to rise from the earth like a final, insurmountable barrier. Each step toward it was an act of will, a quiet war waged against the screaming protests of her muscles and the arid despair in her throat. Her dress, once a hopeful shade of pale blue, was now a tattered flag of surrender, faded by the sun and stained with the dirt of a dozen counties. The hem was frayed into a delicate, sorrowful lace, and a tear along the seam of her shoulder had been inexpertly mended with thread of a darker color. Around her wrists, stark against skin that was both sunburnt and unnaturally pale, were strips of torn cotton cloth, wrapped neatly but with a purpose that spoke of injury rather than adornment. They hid what lay beneath, but they drew the eye all the more for their presence. Her face was a mask of dust and sweat, cheekbones sharp as flint beneath skin stretched taut. But it was her eyes that told the truest story. They were the color of a stormy sky, filled with a deep, hunted watchfulness. Yet, in their depths, a stubborn flame refused to be extinguished. She was terrified, but she was not broken. She had been bent by the world, but she would not bow. The ranch was named Dry Lantern Ridge, a name that suited its stark and unyielding character. The main house was a simple, sturdy cabin of dark, sun-bleached wood, its porch a shadow that seemed to deepen the encroaching twilight. It was from this porch that the rhythmic, ringing sound of a hammer striking metal emanated a steady, forceful beat that was the ranch's only pulse. There, a man stood hunched over an anvil, his back to the road. He was tall and broad, built of the same unadorned substance as the land he worked. His name was Ezra Vale, and at 36, he had the quiet, settled solidity of an old oak. His sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle, slick with a sheen of sweat that caught the dying light. He was shaping a horseshoe, his movements economical and precise, each strike of the hammer a testament to years of practice. The air around him smelled of hot iron, scorched hoof, and the faint, clean scent of his sweat. He moved with a kind of contained energy, a powerful stillness that suggested he was a man who wasted nothing, not a motion, not a word, not a thought. Cora stopped at the gate, her hand hovering over the wooden latch, her breath catching in her throat. For a long moment, she simply stood there, gathering the last dregs of her courage. The sound of the hammering stopped. The abrupt silence was louder than the noise it replaced, heavy and expectant. She saw the man straighten up, his head turning slightly in her direction. He didn't move from the porch, just stood there, a formidable silhouette against the dark wood of the cabin. Finally, she pushed the gate open. It groaned on its hinges, a sound of protest that echoed in the quiet yard. She walked toward the porch, her worn-out boots making soft, shuffling sounds in the dust. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, her hands clasped in front of her, the wrapped wrists a stark admission of her vulnerability. "Mr." Her voice was a dry, rasping whisper, cracked from thirst and disuse. It sounded like sand scraping against stone. "I was wondering if you had any work, anything at all. I can wash dishes, sweep floors. I'm a hard worker." Ezra Vale turned fully to face her. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke more of squinting into the distance than of smiling. His eyes were a deep, steady brown, and he looked at her with an unnerving calmness, the way a man might assess a spooked horse, noting the flared nostrils and the trembling hide, calculating the risk without judgment. His gaze flickered from her face to her torn dress, lingered for a fraction of a second on her bandaged wrists, and then returned to her eyes. He didn't ask her name or where she came from. The land was full of people running from something. Questions were a luxury, and often a cruelty. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, not of welcome, but of acknowledgement. He gestured with his chin toward a large metal basin resting on a stump near the cabin's side. "Water's in the well," he said, his voice a low, even baritone that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "Don't waste it." It wasn't an offer of a job. Not yet. It was a test, and a reprieve. Cora felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She murmured a thank you, her voice still a broken thing, and made her way to the well. The crank was heavy, and her arms trembled with the effort of drawing the bucket up, but the water that sloshed over the side was clear and cold, and the first sip she took was a miracle, a blessing that washed the dust from her throat and seemed to extinguish a fire that had been burning inside her for weeks. He watched her drink, his expression unreadable, before turning back to his work. The ringing of the hammer began again, a steady, indifferent rhythm. Cora filled the basin and began to wash, the cool water a balm on her chapped, raw hands. When she had finished the small pile of tin plates and utensils that had been left by the door, she carried the basin to the edge of the yard to empty it, careful not to spill a drop near the porch. When she turned back, Ezra was standing in the doorway, holding the screen door open. He simply looked at her, and she understood it as an invitation to enter. The inside of the cabin was even sparer than the outside had suggested. It was one room, dominated by function. A sturdy table, scrubbed clean, stood in the center with a single straight-backed chair tucked beneath it. Against the far wall was a bed, neatly made with a dark wool blanket. A stone hearth, swept clean of ash, occupied another wall, and a small, cast-iron stove stood beside it. There were no pictures on the walls, no curtains on the single window, no rug on the wide-planked floor. The place was relentlessly masculine and solitary. It was not a home. It was a shelter, a place where a man came to eat and sleep before facing the wilderness again. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, old leather, and a profound, settled loneliness. It was a silence that had been carved out over years, deep and unbroken. Cora's presence felt like a violation of that silence. The soft scrape of her boots on the wood floor was an intrusion. She stood just inside the door, unsure of what to do next. The rhythmic clatter of her washing the dishes had been a shield, a purpose. Now, inside this quiet, masculine space, she felt exposed again, her raggedness and desperation on full display. Ezra moved past her, his sheer size seeming to shrink the small room even further. He went to a shelf and took down a can of beans, opening it with a knife from his belt. He didn't offer her any. He sat at the table, in the single chair, and began to eat directly from the can, his movements as efficient and unhurried as they had been at the anvil. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft scrape of his spoon against the tin. Outside, the sky was deepening to a bruised purple, and through the clean glass of the window, Cora saw the shadow of a hawk glide silently across the yard, a dark omen against the fading light. She found herself watching his hands. They were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred, but there was a competence in them, a sureness in the way he held the can, the way he moved. He ate without looking at her, but she felt his awareness of her presence, his gaze, when it did lift from his meal, would sometimes pass over her. A fleeting, observational glance that took in the fading bruises on her cheek, the way she held her arm to protect her ribs, the persistent tremor in her hands. He saw it all. She was sure of it. But he asked no questions. He just ate his beans while the silence in the room grew thicker, more profound. When he was finished, he wiped his knife clean on his trousers and stood. The meal was over. The day was over. Cora's heart began to pound a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. Would he send her out into that vast, predatory darkness? "Thank you, mister," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For the water." He looked at her for a long moment, his face impassive in the gloom. Then he walked over to a wooden chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out a thick, worn-out wool blanket. It smelled faintly of horse and wood smoke. He didn't hand it to her. He walked to the hearth and laid the blanket on the floorboards beside it. "You can sleep there," he said. His voice was not unkind, but it was devoid of any softness. It was a statement of fact, a practical arrangement. Then he did something that sent a different kind of signal through her fear-shot nerves. He went to the corner by the door and picked up a long rifle, checking the action with a familiar, practiced motion. He didn't point it or brandish it. He simply leaned it against the wall next to the door, its dark barrel catching a faint gleam from the last light filtering through the window. The gesture was clear. The weapon was not for her. It was for whatever was outside. With that, he moved to his own bed, took off his boots, and lay down. Turning his back to the room, he was asleep, or feigning it, within moments. Darkness fell completely, thick and absolute, pressing in on the small cabin. The wind picked up, moaning softly around the eaves. Cora sank down onto the blanket, the rough wool a comfort against her cheek. The floor was hard, but the spot near the hearth retained a faint, residual warmth from a long-dead fire. The darkness in the cabin was different from the darkness she had been running through for weeks. That had been a darkness full of unseen threats, of rustling sounds in the brush, of the terrifying possibility of discovery. This darkness was a sanctuary. It was dense and heavy, but it was not menacing. It was a shared, quiet dark, guarded by a silent man and his rifle. She lay there, listening to the sound of his slow, steady breathing, a deep and even rhythm that was as constant as the hammer striking the anvil had been. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the frantic, terrified bird in her chest began to settle. Her body, coiled tight with tension for so long, slowly began to unspool. The exhaustion she had held at bay for so long washed over her in a great, crushing wave. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, sleep came not as a brief, troubled stupor, but as a deep, merciful tide. It pulled her under, into a place of quiet and stillness. But even in the depths of that long overdue peace, some part of her remained awake. Her heart, schooled by terror and flight, kept its old habit, listening in the dark for the sound of a footstep, for the creak of a floorboard, for the world to come and take everything away again. Cora woke to a change in the quality of the silence. Before the sun, the high desert was a void, a deep, cold stillness that pressed against the thin cabin walls. But now, there was a faint, rhythmic friction.
Thwack, thwack.
She opened her eyes. The single room was submerged in a pre-dawn gray, a light so thin and watery it seemed to chill the air. She was still on the floor by the hearth, the residual warmth gone, the floorboards hard beneath the thin blanket. The sound was coming from the porch. She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. Every joint was a geography of old aches and new pains. Peering through the small, clean window, she saw him. Ezra Vale was already dressed, standing in the yard, cinching the saddle on a tall roan. He moved with an economy that was almost silent, his hands knowing the leather, the buckles, the weight of the work. The faint light caught the plane of his back, and the sun-bleached cotton of his shirt pulled taut across his shoulders, revealing the solid, functional strength beneath. He was a man made of the same unyielding material as the landscape he inhabited. He did not fight the land. He simply endured it, matched its quiet force with his own. Cora knew, with the instinct of the hunted, that she could not be found idle. She had been given shelter, a single night's reprieve, but she had not earned a second. She folded the blanket precisely, placing it back on the chest at the foot of his bed, her movements quiet as a mouse. She found the broom near the door. It was a pathetic thing, the bristles worn down on one side, the handle cracked, held together by a hopeful strip of rawhide. It was a tool that matched her own brokenness. She slipped out onto the porch, the cold air a slap to her face. It was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of dust and the faint, sweet smell of juniper. She began to sweep. The dry thwack of the bristles on the wood, her first payment on an unstated debt. She worked with a desperate, focused energy, chasing the dust from the corners, her body moving in a rhythm of gratitude and fear. Ezra finished with his horse and walked toward the house, his steps heavy and sure on the packed earth. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her. His face was unreadable in the gray light, his shadow long and imposing. Cora's breath caught, her hands tightening on the splintered broom handle. He watched her for a moment, his gaze flat and assessing. Then he nodded toward the darkest corner of the porch, where the shadows still clung.
"Missed a spot," he said.
His voice was a low baritone, as flat as the land itself. There was no cruelty in it, no malice, no impatience. It was simply an observation, a statement of fact from a man who valued thoroughness. Cora felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, a mix of shame and a strange, sharp relief. An insult she would have understood. A kindness would have undone her. This simple, practical correction was a language she could navigate.
"Yes, sir,"
she whispered. She immediately moved to the corner, the broom attacking the lingering dust. He didn't wait to watch her finish. He just walked past her, the scent of leather and cold air trailing him, and disappeared into the vast, pale expanse of the flats. The sound of his horse's hooves faded, devoured by the immense silence, leaving her utterly alone. The cabin, which had felt so small and crowded with his presence, now seemed hollow, a resonant, empty box. She finished the porch, then moved inside. She found a small sack of beans, a sliver of salt pork, and a tin of coffee. She built up the fire, her hands trembling slightly, and began to cook. The smell of coffee, sharp and smoky, was the first scent of comfort she had known in months. She cooked the beans, but she couldn't bring herself to eat at the table. The single chair, his chair, felt like a throne, a seat of judgment. It was too intimate, too much of an intrusion. When the food was ready, she spooned a small portion onto a tin plate and took it outside, retreating to the bottom step of the porch. She sat huddled in on herself, eating in the strengthening light. The plate balanced on her knees. The wind was picking up, and she had to guard her food from the dust. But she felt safer out here. The open space was a comfort. It gave her room to breathe, to watch the horizon, to keep the old habit of listening for pursuit. Hours passed. The sun climbed, burning the gray mist off the land, turning the world to a hard, bright gold. She had washed the dishes and was hesitating, wondering what to do next. Scrub the floor, try to patch the garden when the sound of hoofbeats returned. He rode into the yard, dismounted, and looped the reins over the hitching post. He walked to the porch, his face streaked with sweat and dust. He nodded at her, a curt acknowledgement of her continued presence, and went inside. Cora stayed on the step, her heart thumping. What now? From inside, she heard the scrape of the spoon in the iron pot. Then, a distinct clink of a tin bowl being set on the table. A pause, a second clink. He was setting two places. A longer pause followed. A stillness so profound it felt as if the world had stopped turning. Then, the soft, hesitant scrape of one bowl being slid back across the wood, and the faint thud of it being replaced on the shelf. Cora looked down at her hands, her face burning. She had seen nothing, yet she had seen everything. That simple, unconscious motion setting a second bowl was a crack in the fortress of his solitude. It was the ghost of a habit, or perhaps the beginning of a new one, immediately regretted. It was an admission of loneliness so profound and unconscious it made her own isolation ache. He ate his meal standing by the stove. When he emerged, he did not look at her, but his voice stopped her as she was about to fetch more water. "You can stay the week." Cora's head snapped up. She looked at him, searching his face for the meaning behind the words. It was an offer, but it sounded like a verdict. "A week," she breathed. He nodded, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder, on the distant blue line of the mesas. "I need the fences checked on the South Ridge. It's a 2-day ride. The cabin. It's better if someone's here. Keep the fire. Watch the stock." He was giving her a reason, a practical purpose that allowed them both to pretend this was a simple transaction. He was hiring her, not helping her. Relief, sharp and debilitating, washed through her, so strong her knees went weak. A week, 7 days, 7 nights of not running, 7 nights of a roof, a fire, and a locked door. The relief was quickly followed by a cold prickle of fear. And after the week, she pushed that thought down. A week was a lifetime. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger than it had been the day before. "I'll work for my keep." He just grunted, a sound of acknowledgement, and turned to tend to his horse. The contract was sealed. The next morning, she woke to a different sound. Shing, shing, shing. A sharp, meditative scraping of stone on steel. The lamp was lit, casting a pool of yellow light on the table. Ezra was sitting in his chair, drawing a long hunting knife across a whetstone. His head was bowed, his focus absolute, the muscles in his forearm flexing with each precise, patient stroke. Cora rose from her blanket, the new rhythm of the house already settling into her bones. She moved to the wash basin, gathering the dishes from the night before. She took them outside, the air so cold it stung her lungs, the water in the barrel stinging her hands. He emerged as the sky was turning a pale, bruised pink. He stood on the porch, sipping coffee from a tin mug, watching her. Her hands were red and chapped, but she worked steadily. "You're up before the light," he observed. It wasn't a question. Cora paused, her hands submerged in the icy water. She looked up at him, a shadow against the brightening sky. I like the quiet." It was the first thing she had offered about herself, a small, true piece of her identity. Ezra took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked out over the vast, silent land, now emerging from the shadows. "It's all there is here," he replied. It was not an agreement. It was not a comfort or a welcome. It was a shared statement of fact. They were two people who, for their own reasons, understood the value of silence. He nodded, as if she had passed another small, unspoken test, and went back inside. The day passed. He rode out again. And she worked. She scrubbed the floorboards until the wood grain showed. She beat the dust from the few rugs until her arms ached. She found his mending kit, a rough wooden box with coarse thread and thick needles, and set it on the table. He returned at midday, the sun a white fire in the sky. The cabin was hot. She had the meal ready, more beans, but she'd found flour and made a passable, if heavy, flatbread. She served him a plate, then fixed her own, her eyes down, preparing to retreat to the porch. "Sit down." The words, spoken quietly, rooted her to the spot. She looked up. He was already at the table, his plate in front of him. With his fork, he pointed to the other side of the table, where the second plate, the ghost plate, sat waiting. "That one's yours," he said. Her throat tightened. To sit at his table, in his presence, was an entirely different arrangement. The porch was for strays. The table was for something else. It meant turning her back to the door, the only escape route. It was an act of profound trust, a gamble she wasn't sure she was ready to make. He didn't rush her, He just waited, his gaze on his plate. Slowly, her boots whispering on the clean floor. Cora moved to the table. She slid into the empty chair. It felt enormous, a declaration. She sat on the very edge, poised to bolt, her plate held tight. They ate in complete silence, but this silence was new. It was not the empty void of the plains or the tents, assessing quiet of the day before. It was a shared silence, filled with the small sounds of living, the clink of forks on tin, the soft sound of breathing, the creak of the chairs. It was the most terrifying and the most comforting meal she had ever eaten. That evening, the work was done. A fragile truce had settled over the small cabin. Cora sat by the hearth, the fire painting her face in flickering shades of orange and red. Ezra was at the table, cleaning his rifle, the metallic smell of oil and solvent filling the air. She watched him check his shirt, the one he had worn the day before. She saw the long, L-shaped tear on the sleeve, where it had snagged on wire or thorn. He tossed it aside, then picked up his mending kit. He fumbled with a thick needle and coarse thread, his large, calloused hands clumsy with the delicate task. "I can do that," Cora said, her voice quiet in the fire-lit room. Ezra paused, the needle halfway through the fabric. He looked at her, then at her own ragged clothes. Skepticism was plain on his face. I'm good with a needle," she said, a faint echo of pride in her voice. "It's one thing I know how to do well." He looked at her for a long, assessing moment. He was a man who understood skill. He saw the stillness in her, the quiet competence she held back. He weighed the proposition. Finally, with a sigh that was part frustration, part resignation, he tossed the shirt and the kit into her lap. Cora set aside his crude tools. From a hidden pocket in her own torn skirt, she retrieved a small, cloth-wrapped packet. Inside, nested in felt, were 2 fine steel needles and a spool of dark, strong thread, a remnant of another life. She turned the sleeve to the light. Her hands, which had trembled in fear and shook from cold, were now perfectly, unnervingly steady. She began to sew. The needle moved with a fluid, practiced grace, a tiny silver fish diving in and out of the rough blue cotton. Her stitches were small, tight, and perfectly even. It was not mending. It was restoration. Ezra stopped cleaning his rifle. He watched her. He watched the way the firelight caught the earnest concentration in her face. He saw her, perhaps for the first time, not as a collection of needs and fears, but as a person of skill. Her raggedness, her wrapped wrists, her haunted eyes, they all faded, replaced by the profound, simple competence of her hands. She was repairing his world, one tiny, perfect stitch at a time. When she finished, she bit the thread with her teeth and handed the shirt back to him. He took it, the fabric still warm from her lap. He ran his thumb over the seam. It was a dense, strong ridge, barely visible, smoother and stronger than the original. A strange, unfamiliar feeling washed over him, a grudging, surprised gratitude. It was an awkward sensation, one he didn't have words for. "Good work," he said, his voice gruff. It was the highest praise he could offer. Cora simply nodded, accepting the compliment, and tucked her small needle case back into her pocket, guarding her one small piece of a life that was. They sat in the new quiet, the rifle parts laid out on the table, the mended shirt folded neatly beside them. And then, a new sound, a low, deep rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. It vibrated up through the floorboards, making the tin cups on the shelf rattle softly. Distant thunder. Cora's head lifted, her body instantly rigid, the old, hunted look flooding back into her eyes. A storm on the plains was a violent, terrifying thing, a chaotic force that tore away shelter and exposed everything. Ezra was already looking at the window, his expression hard. A storm meant a potential stampede, fences down, flash floods in the arroyos. It was a threat to his very survival. Their eyes met across the small, fire-lit cabin. In that single, shared glance, an unspoken truth passed between them. He saw her terror, a fear of violence, of being caught, of the world's random cruelty. She saw his a fear of nature, of loss, of the relentless, impersonal forces that could wipe a man's life work away in a single night. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just looked at each other. Two small, solitary figures in a vast, darkening land, while outside, unseen in the distance, the storm gathered its strength. The morning after the thunder, the air was heavy and thick, holding its breath. The storm had rumbled itself out on the horizon, leaving the juniper flats in a state of tense, dry anticipation. Inside the cabin, the silence was its own kind of weather. It was the fourth day. Cora moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, her steps no longer the tentative shuffles of a trespasser. She was repaying her keep in every way she knew. The floors were scrubbed. The single window was clear, and the small supply of firewood was neatly stacked. This morning, she was tending the fire, her movements economical as she heated water for coffee. The handle of the heavy iron kettle was wrapped in a cloth, but the cloth was thin, and in a moment of distraction, a sudden clatter from the corral outside that sent a jolt of her old fear through her. Her grip slipped. The kettle tilted, splashing a heavy wave of boiling water over the back of her left hand. A white-hot shock of pain seared up her arm. She cried out, a sharp, stifled sound, more a gasp than a scream. She had learned long ago not to make noise when she was hurt. She bit her lip, tasting blood, as she dropped the kettle onto the hearth, the clatter loud in the small room. Tears of pure, agonizing pain sprang to her eyes, blinding her. Ezra was at the table, mending a bridle, his head bent over the leather. At her sound, he didn't just stand, he moved. It was a fluid, startling explosion of motion, like a cougar leaping from a branch. In 2 long strides, he was across the room. Cora was clutching her hand to her chest, trembling violently, her face pale with shock. She flinched as he approached, bracing for a blow, for the anger she associated with any accident, any mistake. He didn't speak. He didn't curse her clumsiness. He simply took her right arm in a grip of iron, just above the elbow, and pulled her toward the door. He was strong, and his grip was not gentle, but it wasn't cruel. It was urgent. He hauled her outside, his long strides forcing her to almost run to keep up. He didn't stop until they reached the water trough by the well, a long, deep basin filled with icy cold groundwater. "Hand," he commanded, his voice a low growl. She hesitated, confused, the pain a roaring fire in her veins. With an impatient grunt, he seized her injured left wrist. His grip was firm, his calloused fingers wrapping completely around her delicate bones. He plunged her hand directly into the frigid water. The shock of the cold was almost as violent as the burn. It stole her breath. But a second later, the icy water began its merciful work, pulling the fire from her skin, numbing the screaming nerves. She sagged against the trough, her knees weak, the tears she had held back now tracking clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. He held her there. He didn't let go. His large, warm hand was a manacle around her wrist, keeping her hand submerged in the healing cold. He stood over her, a solid, unmoving wall of muscle and denim, blocking the harsh morning sun. Minutes passed. The only sound was her ragged breathing and the distant, indifferent cry of a hawk. The trembling in her body subsided, leaving only a deep, aching throb from her hand. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, still rough. "Better." She managed a nod, unable to find her voice. He released his grip on her elbow, but kept his hold on her wrist, drawing her hand from the water. The skin was a furious, alarming red, the flesh already puckering into white blisters. It was a bad burn. Still holding her wrist, he led her back to the cabin. He sat her down in his chair at the table the first time she had ever occupied it. She was too dazed to protest. He moved to his small shelf, retrieved a tin of lard, and then tore a long, clean strip from a flour sack. He sat on the small stool opposite her. The table, which had felt like a vast wooden plane during their silent meals, now felt as small as a checkerboard. He was close, too close. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his sweat, the leather of the bridle he'd been mending, and the smoky wood ash that clung to his clothes. "Give it here," he said. She laid her trembling red hand on the table, palm down. He worked with the same intense, practical focus he gave to his horseshoes. He scooped a generous amount of lard onto his fingers and, with a touch that was astonishingly gentle for a man of his size and roughness, he slathered it over the burn. His calloused fingertips were impossibly light, barely grazing her skin, but the cool grease was a profound relief. Then he took the strip of cotton. He wrapped her hand, starting at the wrist, his movements deft and sure. He bound her hand firmly, but not too tight, covering the wounded skin, protecting it from the air. When he was done, he tucked the end of the cloth in, securing it with a small knot he tied with a single-handed pull. His head was bent, his attention focused entirely on the task. Cora found herself staring at the crown of his head, at the way his dark hair, badly cut, curled slightly at his collar. When he finished, he didn't immediately let go. His large hand still rested on the table, cupping her now bandaged one. He lifted his head. Their eyes met. Cora's heart stopped. She was prepared for anything: anger, impatience, or the one thing she dreaded most, pity. She saw none of them. His gaze was steady, a deep, quiet brown. It was not soft. It was assessing. He was looking at her, at the tear stains on her face, at the tremor in her chin. But he was not looking at her as if she were a broken, pathetic thing. He was looking at her as if she were a fence line that had held against a stampede, damaged but still standing. It was a look of quiet, profound, and wordless respect. In that moment, she was not a stray he had taken in. She was not a victim. She was just a person who had been hurt, and he had fixed it. He finally released her hand, the warmth of his grip lingering, and stood up. He picked up the kettle she had dropped and went outside to refill it, his boots heavy on the porch. The domestic rhythm, so violently interrupted, resumed as if nothing had happened. But everything had. That night, a new ritual was born. When Cora went to lay out her blanket by the hearth, she found something waiting for her on the stone. It was a tin cup, filled nearly to the brim with milk, pale and luminous in the firelight. She looked over at Ezra. He was already on his bed, his back to her, a still, dark shape under the wool blanket. He had left it for her without a word. Milk was a luxury. It was for strength, for healing. It was not a gesture of charity. It was a provision, a silent acknowledgement of her injury. It was, in the stark and unforgiving landscape of her life, a small, quiet miracle. She drank it slowly, the cool, rich liquid a balm for her throat, and she slept more deeply that night than she ever had, the faint, medicinal smell of lard and clean cotton rising from her bandaged hand. The days found a new rhythm, settling around her injury. She learned to work one-handed, sweeping the porch with awkward, jerky motions, kneading dough against the side of the bowl. But the work itself was changing her. She took to washing his clothes, hanging them on a line he strung for her between the porch post and a small juniper. Each morning, she would pin his heavy denim trousers and cotton shirts to the line. The act was intimate, grounding. She would stand in the bright, harsh sunlight, the clothespins in her mouth, and watch the wind snap the fabric, filling the empty clothes with a semblance of life. The sun was a relentless, cleansing force. As the week stretched on, she noticed the bruises on her own arms. The old, dark shadows left by another man's hands were fading. The sun and the wind were bleaching them, turning the ugly blue-black marks into faint, yellowish stains, and then, finally, into nothing at all. They were ghosts being exorcised by the relentless, clarifying light of the juniper flats. The sounds of the ranch became her clock. The morning was the sharp thwack of Ezra's axe splitting wood. The afternoon was the creak of harness leather and the soft thud of hooves on packed earth as he worked his small herd of cattle. The evenings were the jingle of spurs on the porch floor. These sounds replaced the ones that had haunted her for months, the sound of her own running footsteps, the panicked hammering of her own heart, the crack of a branch in the darkness. This was the pulse of a life, not a flight. One afternoon, she was resting her hand, sitting on the porch steps, hidden by the shadow of the roof. Ezra was in the corral with the gray mare, a young, stubborn creature with a mean streak. Cora had watched him try to gentle her before, with a hard hand and a cursed word, and the mare had only fought him harder. But today, he was different. He stood in the center of the dusty corral, the horse circling him at a distance. He wasn't using a whip. He wasn't shouting. He was talking. His voice, usually so flat and hard, was a low, patient rumble. "Now, see," he murmured, as the horse tossed its head. "That does you no good at all. You just fightin' yourself." The mare stopped, her ears pricked. "That's a girl," he soothed. "Just stand. Just see I ain't the wolf. I'm just a man, and you're just a horse, and we got work to do." He took a slow step. The mare held her ground. He spoke to her about the wind, about the lack of rain, about the stubbornness of juniper roots. He never raised his voice. It was a gruff, patient, one-sided conversation, a long, rumbling monologue of pure, gentle sense. Cora sat, hidden, and listened. A slow, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. This was the man who had held her hand in the freezing water, the man who left milk by the fire. This was the man beneath the armor, a man who possessed a deep, buried well of patience, a gruff tenderness he saved for unbroken things. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, the first in so long she had forgotten the feel of it. The week that he had offered her came and went. He didn't mention it. She didn't ask. The arrangement simply continued, solidifying with each shared, silent meal. One hot, still midday, a wind picked up from the south. It didn't bring coolness, but it brought the smell of the high desert. Cora was carrying a bucket of water from the well, her bandaged hand making the load awkward. The wind hit her in a sudden gust, surrounding her in a cloud of fine, rosy gold powder. It was pollen from the blooming sagebrush on the ridges. It clung to the dampness of her skin, to her hair, settling like a fine dust on her patched blue dress. She stopped, breathing in the sharp, herbal scent. She caught her reflection in the trembling water of the bucket. She saw a face streaked with dust and pollen, her hair escaping its bun, her lips chapped. But the fear was gone from her eyes. In its place was a profound, settled weariness. The golden dust on her cheekbones caught the sun. It was a tired beauty, the beauty of something that had endured and was, against all odds, still standing. The cabin remained a small, one-room world. But as the days passed, the space within it changed. At first, their movements had been sharp and angular, a geometry of avoidance. They would freeze if they came too close, murmur a pardon, and retreat to their separate corners. Now, a new dance had been established. It was a silent, fluid choreography. When she was at the hearth and he needed to get to the shelf behind her, he would simply wait, and she, without looking, would sense his presence and lean forward, giving him just enough room to pass. When he sat at the table cleaning his tack, she would move around him to set the pot on the stove, her arm passing inches from his shoulder, neither of them flinching. They learned to operate in the cramped quarters without touching, but the awareness of each other was a constant, tangible thing. It was in the air between them. It was the radiated warmth she felt when he passed behind her. It was the current that seemed to flow in the small space when he brushed her sleeve as he reached for the coffee. They had mastered the art of physical avoidance, and in doing so, had become more profoundly, electrically aware of each other than any clumsy touch could have made them. And then, one evening, she broke the silence. She was washing the tin plates from supper, her good hand doing the scrubbing, her bandaged one supporting the plate. She was thinking of nothing, just the feeling of the warm, soapy water. A sound rose in her throat, an unconscious echo of a life long past. It was a low, tuneless humming, a forgotten melody her mother used to sing while baking. She didn't even realize she was doing it until she saw Ezra's hands stop. He was at the table, running an oiled cloth over the barrel of his rifle. His hands, which had been moving in a steady, rhythmic slide, went perfectly still. Cora froze, the hum dying in her throat. She flushed, embarrassed, feeling as if she had shouted in a church. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Ezra didn't look up. He just kept his hands on the rifle. After a long moment, he resumed his work, the cloth sliding over the steel. "Don't be," he said, his voice flat. But it was a command, not a dismissal. She turned back to the basin, but she didn't hum again. Not that night. But the sound had been made. It had woken the cabin. Ezra finished his work, but he sat at the table for a long time. He looked around the room, at her blanket by the hearth, at the strip of cotton she'd used for a dish rag, at the small, neat stitches on his mended shirt. He had built this cabin with his own hands as a fortress against the world, a place of unbreachable solitude. He had crafted his silence like a shield. Her humming had breached it, and the most terrifying part was he had not wanted it to stop. He realized, with a jolt that was almost physical, that the silence in the cabin was no longer empty. For years, it had been a hollow, echoing void. Now, it was full. It was charged with her presence, with the scent of her, with the quiet rustle of her movements. The room, which had only ever been a shelter, suddenly had a center, and that center was the small, humming woman by the wash basin. Late that night, the rain finally came. It didn't start with a storm, but with a few fat, hesitant drops. Then, as if the sky had finally given up its long-held burden, it opened, a steady, cleansing, determined rain began to fall. The sound on the tin roof was immense, a deafening, rhythmic drumming that drowned out all other thought. It was the sound of the world being washed clean. Cora was awakened by it. She sat up on her blanket, startled. Ezra was already at the cabin door, standing in the frame, looking out. She rose and walked to stand near him, not beside him, but a few feet behind. The door was open to the night, and a cool, damp spray misted their faces. The air was electric, charged with the smell of wet dust, of the thirsty earth drinking, of the sap rising in the juniper. It was the most beautiful smell in the world. They stood there for a long time, two silent figures watching the deluge. The water ran in rivers through the yard, washing away the dust, the pollen, the old tracks. It was washing away the heat, the drought, the past. It was a clean start. The clean, rain-washed world lasted 3 days. It was a fragile peace, a pocket of quiet carved out of the high, lonely country. Cora's hand, now wrapped in a fresh, paler strip of cloth, had subsided to a dull, manageable ache. The rhythms of the ranch had taken hold of her, the steady beat of chores a reassurance against the chaos she had fled. The silence between her and Ezra was no longer empty. It was a shared space, a thing they were building together, like a low stone wall. She was outside, near the small, struggling garden, hanging the last of the washed linens on the line Ezra had strung. The sun was warm on her back, and the smell of the damp cotton and the sharp scent of juniper felt like a kind of safety. That was when she heard the horse. It wasn't Ezra's. She knew the sound of his roan, the heavy, ground-eating stride. This was a lighter, faster gait, and it was coming up the main track from the direction of Cedar Hollow, the pass that led to the wider, more populated valleys. A man on a dark bay horse pulled up just outside the open gate. Not dismounting, he sat tall in a silver inlaid saddle, a stark contrast to Ezra's plain, functional tack. His boots were polished to a high, black shine, catching the morning sun in a way that seemed obscene in the dusty yard. He wore a string tie and a clean duster, and a faint, thin-lipped smile played on his mouth. His name was Miles Hart, a man who made his living on the edges of other men's fortunes, a buyer of rumors and seller of debts. Cora froze, her hands still in the air, a wet sheet clutched between them. Her heart gave a single, hard kick of pure, animal terror, the old instinct flooding her veins. Miles Hart tipped his hat, an exaggerated gesture of mock politeness. His eyes, the color of muddy water, roved over her, taking in her mended dress, her bare feet in the dust, and the cabin door just behind her. "Well, now," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. It was a smooth, oiled sound, the kind of voice that slid into cracks. Dry Lantern Ridge. Always figured old Vale was the kind who preferred his own company. Seems I figured wrong. Cora said nothing. She did not move. She felt like a rabbit pinned by a hawk's shadow. He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. He looked from her to the cabin, then back, his gaze lingering on the domesticity of the laundry line. "No need to be shy, little lady." He leaned forward on his saddle horn, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, carrying whisper. "It's no secret. When a woman shows up with nothing but the clothes on her back, well, everyone knows whose bed she's in." The words struck her like a slap. They were cheap, ugly, and aimed to stain. They took the quiet, respectful space Ezra had given her the floor by the hearth, the separate blanket, and smeared it with the world's ugliest assumptions. The wet sheet twisted in her hands, the fabric groaning under the sudden, violent tension of her grip. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin feeling cold and tight. "That's enough," a new voice said. It was Ezra. He had come from the barn, silent on the soft earth. He stood just at the corner of the porch, his hands empty at his sides. He hadn't yet put on his gun belt for the day, and his shirt, the one she had mended, was unbuttoned halfway down his chest, revealing the dark hair and hard muscle beneath. His eyes were not angry. They were shut, dark and flat and final, like polished obsidian. Miles' Hart's slick smile faltered. He hadn't heard the other man approach. He straightened up in his saddle, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip, then stopping when he realized Ezra wasn't armed. It made him bolder. "Just making conversation with the help Vale," Miles sneered. "I said?" Ezra repeated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "That's enough." He took one step forward, off the porch and onto the earth of the yard. The single step was more threatening than a shout. "Get off my land!" The air became thin, stretched tight as a bowstring. The only sounds were the stamp of Miles's horse. Sensing the tension and the soft drip, drip, drip of water from the sheet in Cora's hands, Miles looked at the man standing in the yard. He saw the sheer, solid breadth of Ezra's shoulders, the rooted stillness in his stance. He saw a man who didn't need a gun to be dangerous, a man who looked like he could tear the gate from its hinges with his bare hands. This was not a fight Miles could win, or one he was willing to have. His currency was words, not blood. He gathered his reins, his veneer of superiority cracking. "No need to get hostile. A man can't be blamed for stating the obvious." "Now," Ezra said. The word was an iron command. With a final, venomous glance at Cora, Miles' Hart pulled his horse's head around in a sharp, angry yank. He kicked the bay into a canter, clearing the gate and disappearing down the track, leaving a cloud of dust and his verbal poison hanging in the clean, rain-washed air. The silence that rushed back in was awful. Cora's arms were shaking so badly she could no longer hold up the sheet. It fell from her grasp, landing in a heap in the dust she had just swept. And then her whole body began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that started in her stomach and radiated out to her fingertips. Ezra turned to her. His face was still hard, but the flat, dangerous look was fading, replaced by a flicker of something else, confusion. He had solved the problem. The threat was gone. Why was she still shaking? She backed away, stumbling over the fallen laundry, her hands coming up to her mouth as if to stifle a scream. She turned and fled into the cabin. He followed, his heavy boots loud on the porch boards. He found her in the center of the room, by the table, but she was not there. She was 1,000 miles away, her eyes wide and blank, staring at the wall. She was trembling so violently her teeth chattered. "Cora," he said. She flinched, a sharp, convulsive movement, as if he had struck her. "He's gone," Ezra said, his voice rough. "He won't be back." "It was the sound," she whispered, her voice a reedy, broken thing. "Your voice, it was so loud." Ezra stopped. He had not shouted. He had not raised his voice. He had simply spoken with the force of his anger. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the way she was holding her arms, wrapped around her middle, protecting herself. He saw the raw, abject terror in her eyes, a terror that had nothing to do with Miles' heart and everything to do with him. The hard-bitten, practical man of the frontier was at a loss. He did not know how to fix this, but as he looked at her, trembling in the middle of his floor, he recognized the tremor. It was an old, familiar echo. He backed away, deliberately, putting the table between them. He gave her the space she craved. He leaned back against the wall by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression settling into a deep, uncomfortable gloom. "My PA," he said, his voice quiet, directed at the floorboards, not at her. He was a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice, especially when he was drinking. Cora's head lifted, her trembling hitched, her gaze slowly focused on him. "This cabin," Ezra continued, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "It's quiet. I built it that way." He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. I grew up with the sound of shouting, the sound of things hitting walls, fists." He looked at her then, his eyes stripped of all their hardness, revealing the bleak, lonely landscape of his own past. "I know that echo, Cora," he said, his voice raw. "I know how long it lasts in your bones, long after the noise stops." He was not offering comfort. He was offering a confession. He was telling her that her brokenness was not alien to him. It was a language he spoke fluently. The shaking in her body didn't stop, but it changed. The violent, uncontrollable terror subsided, replaced by the deep, shuddering sobs of a grief that had been held back for years. She sank into the single chair at the table, the one he had made her sit in, and she finally wept. She wept for the man who had hit her, for the man who had just insulted her, and, strangely, for the man across the room who understood, in his bones, why a raised voice was the same as a raised hand. Ezra did not move. He did not cross the room. He did not touch her. He stood by the door, a silent guardian, and let her cry, his presence a solid, unmoving promise that the walls of this house would never, ever echo with that sound again. The next day, they were almost out of flour. The trip to Willow Gate, the small cluster of buildings that served as the county's hub, could no longer be avoided. Ezra needed to check a line of traps to the north. He offered to go, but Cora, her face still pale and swollen from her tears, refused. She needed to do this. To be seen trembling in the cabin was one thing. To hide from the world was another. It was a matter of pride. A small, stubborn piece of herself she wouldn't surrender. She took the smaller mule, riding astride like a man, her bandaged hand tucked into her lap. Willow Gate was little more than one dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a smithy, a land office, and the general store. But small towns have the longest memories and the sharpest eyes. When Cora pushed open the door to the mercantile, the little bell above it rang with what felt like a shout of accusation. The store, which usually smelled of coffee beans, molasses, and new leather, seemed to be holding its breath. Mrs. Albright, the proprietor's wife, a woman built like a flour sack with a face to match, was measuring out beans for another customer. 2 other women were standing by the bolts of calico. All 3 of them turned. Their conversation, a low hum of gossip, died instantly, and then the looks began. It was not a simple, curious glance. It was a slow, deliberate, dissecting stare. It started at her worn-out boots, traveled up her mended dress, lingered on her bare wedding finger, and then settled on her face with a cold, flat certainty. In their eyes, she was stripped bare. She was the woman from the laundry line. She was the reason Miles Hart was telling his story in the saloon right now. She was, as he had put it, Vale's creature. Cora's face burned. She felt the blood rush to her cheeks, a hot tide of shame. She walked to the counter, her gaze fixed on the floor. "A 20-pound sack of flour, please, Mrs. Albright," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Mrs." Albright finished with her customer, her movements deliberately slow. She turned to Cora, her expression one of bland, icy disapproval. She did not smile. She did not ask about the weather or Mr. Vale. "That'll be 40 cents, she said, her voice clipped. Cora put the coins on the counter. "Mrs." Albright retrieved the heavy sack, dragging it across the counter and pushing it toward Cora, a clear gesture that she did not want to risk their hands touching. "Livin' together, unwed," one of the women by the calico whispered, just loud enough to be heard. "It's a disgrace. Right under the Lord's nose." "No better than she should be," the other agreed, her voice thick with pious satisfaction. Cora fought the sting of tears. She would not cry here. She would not give them the satisfaction. She grabbed the lip of the heavy flour sack, her good hand taking the strain, and hauled it off the counter. She clutched it to her chest like a shield. She turned and walked out, the bell sounding her retreat. The walk back to the mule felt a mile long, every window a pair of eyes, every shadow a pointing finger. She loaded the sack and mounted, her movement stiff with humiliation. The ride home was infinitely longer than the ride there. The landscape, which had become her sanctuary, now felt vast and accusing. The wind, which had whispered of peace, now seemed to carry the voices from the store. Disgrace. No better than she should be. She wasn't just bringing flour back to the cabin. She was bringing the dirt of the town, the poison of Miles Hart's words, the suffocating judgment of the world. She was the source of the stain. She had taken Ezra's clean, quiet solitude and made it scandalous. When she rode into the yard, he was there, sitting on the porch steps, sharpening his knife. He looked up, and his hand stilled. He knew her face now. He had seen it pale with fear and blotched with tears. He recognized this new look, a pale, hollowed-out despair. He stood as she slid off the mule, her body moving with a leaden exhaustion. "Cora." She untied the flour sack, her good hand fumbling with the knot. "What happened?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it was an order. She finally got the sack free and let it drop to the ground with a soft thud. The sound seemed to break the last thread holding her together. "It's not worth saying," she whispered, turning away from him. Her shoulders slumped, but it was too late. The tears she had refused to shed in town were here, hot and silent, tracking paths through the dust on her face. "Cora!" He came down the steps. She spun to face him, a desperate, hunted animal. "They know everyone knows that man. He told everyone. They look at me like I'm dirt. Like I'm something filthy you've brought into your home." She was unraveling, the words tumbling out of her in a torrent of shame and grief.
"They're right. I'm a disgrace to you. I've ruined your good name."
"You took me in. You were kind, and I've paid you back by making you the town's gossip." She took a deep, shuddering breath, her hands twisting in the fabric of her skirt.
"I have to go. I can't stay. I can't be this for you. I'll go north. I'll find work somewhere else. I won't stain your reputation any longer."
She had offered him the only thing she had left her absence. She stood there, weeping, waiting for him to nod, to agree that this was the only logical solution. Ezra just looked at her. He didn't speak for a long, agonizing minute. The wind picked up, pulling at her hair, but he was as still as the mountains on the horizon. His face was a mask of unreadable granite. He was thinking. He was processing her words, the town's words, the long, silent years of his own life. He was looking at the woman who hummed by his fire, who mended his clothes, who knew the sound of the echo. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, and he didn't just say the words, he hammered them into the air, one by one, like he was forging a horseshoe, each one a final, definitive strike. "This place," he said, his gaze locked on her, "wasn't a home, until you got here." Ezra's words hung in the air between them, heavy and solid and impossible. "This place wasn't a home, until you got here." Cora stared at him, the flour sack a forgotten weight at her feet. The words did not land as a comfort. They landed as a burden, a kindness so vast and undeserved it felt like a new kind of accusation. A home, she, who had only ever known how to unmake things, how to flee from the wreckage she had brought nothing to this place but her own ghosts. And now he was offering her its soul. It was a debt she could never repay, and the knowledge of it was a crushing weight. She shook her head. A small, violent motion. "You don't mean that," she whispered. You're just saying that because you feel sorry for me." Before he could answer, the world outside changed. The sunlight, which had been a clear, high desert gold, suddenly dimmed, as if a great, dusty hand had been swiped across the sky. A strange, greenish-yellow light bled over the landscape, draining the color from the junipers and the red from the earth. The wind, which had been a steady, indifferent presence, suddenly died, leaving a profound, humming silence. It was the deep, held breath before a storm's scream. Ezra's head lifted, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "Get inside," he said, his voice a low command. "Now." But Cora didn't move. In the eerie, unnatural light, her own turmoil found a reflection in the sky. The judgment of the town, the shame, Ezra's impossible kindness, it all swirled inside her, a gathering storm of its own. She couldn't stay. To accept his declaration would be to accept a life she was not worthy of, to pull him down into her own tainted world. To stay would be the ultimate act of selfishness. She had to cut the rot out before it killed the tree. "No," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a desperate, terrible resolve. The first gust of wind hit them. It was not a breeze, it was a physical blow, a solid wall of air that tore at their clothes and filled their mouths with dust. It slammed the cabin door shut with a crack like a rifle shot. The sky to the west had not just darkened, it had curdled, turning a bruised, churning black that was roiling toward them at an impossible speed. "Cora, damn it! Get in the house!" Ezra shouted over the rising howl of the wind. But his words only solidified her purpose. She turned from him, her mind a sudden, narrow point of white-hot clarity. She had to leave. Not tomorrow, not in an hour. Now, in the storm. The storm was her cover, her excuse, her accomplice. She would be a ghost, swallowed by the chaos, leaving nothing behind but a clean slate for the man who had shown her a kindness she couldn't bear. She ran, not toward the cabin, but toward the gate. The wind tore at her, A malevolent, unseen hand that tried to rip the dress from her back and the breath from her lungs. The air was thick with flying grit and leaves. The first drops of rain began to fall, not a gentle shower, but hard, heavy, stinging pellets, as if the sky were throwing stones. Cora! His voice was a roar behind her, snatched away by the wind. She didn't look back. She fumbled with the wooden latch on the gate, her fingers clumsy and numb. The gate, usually so compliant, fought her, the wind pressing it shut. She threw her entire, wiry weight against it, and it groaned open with a sound like a dying animal. She stumbled out onto the track. The ground, so dry and hard just moments before, was already turning to a slick, greedy mud. It pulled at her bare feet, trying to drag her down, to hold her in place. Every step was a battle against the earth and the air. A flicker, and then the world was split in two by a blinding, jagged spear of lightning. It struck a ridge a mile away, and for a single, silent, terrifying second, the entire landscape was illuminated in a stark, skeletal white. In that flash, her face was a portrait of desperate resolve, her hair plastered to her skin, tears and rain mixing into a single, salty flood on her cheeks. She heard him behind her, his heavy boots sucking at the mud, a sound of relentless pursuit. She tried to run faster, but she was sinking, trapped. And then his hand clamped down on her shoulder. It was a grip of iron, born of panic and fury. It spun her around, and for a terrifying second, she thought he would shake her, hit her, punish her for her defiance. "Enough," he roared, his face a mask of rain and desperation, inches from hers. "This is madness. Don't you leave the only safe place you have." His words, meant to be a lifeline, were the final blow. They broke the last, fragile dam holding back the flood of her despair. "Safe!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, broken thing that was barely audible over the storm. "You think this is about a place, a roof? I have never been safe. Not out here. Not in a town. Not anywhere. I have never, ever been safe inside my own skin." The raw, agonizing truth of it hung between them, more powerful than the thunder that cracked directly overhead. Something in Ezra's face shattered. The anger, the frustration, it all dissolved, washed away by the rain and the raw pain in her voice. He was not looking at a stubborn woman defying him. He was looking at a soul in torment, a creature so used to being hunted that it no longer knew how to stand still. His grip on her shoulder, the one that had been so hard and angry, gentled. His fingers, which had been digging into her flesh, softened, the pressure easing until his hand was simply resting there, a point of warmth in the cold. Driving rain, his whole body seemed to slump, the furious energy draining out of him. He pulled his other hand up, not to grab her, but to gently cup the side of her face, his thumb stroking away a mix of rain and tears. "Stay," he said, his voice no longer a roar, but a broken, pleading whisper. "Just stay. Stay until your body forgets how to run. Stay until it remembers what quiet feels like." They stood there, two small figures in the heart of the storm's fury. The wind howled around them, and the rain fell in solid, blinding sheets. He didn't pull her against him in a possessive embrace. He simply stood there, his hand on her shoulder, his other hand on her face, anchoring her to the ground. It was not an act of claiming. It was an act of shielding, a human dam against the flood of her despair. She sagged against his hand, the fight draining out of her, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it was a wonder she was still standing. She leaned into his touch, a small, involuntary movement, and for the first time, she did not flinch. She let him hold her, not in a cage, but in a sanctuary, while the world raged around them. They were two solitary trees leaning against each other in a hurricane, finding a fragile, shared strength in the heart of the chaos. He finally guided her back, one arm firmly around her shoulders, shielding her from the worst of the wind. They stumbled through the mud, through the groaning gate, and onto the porch. He pushed the cabin door open, and a blast of warm, Fire-scented air washed over them. Inside, the storm was a muffled, distant roar. The fire in the hearth was blazing, a defiant point of orange light and warmth against the gray, violent world outside. The small room was an island of peace in an ocean of chaos. He closed the door, shutting out the storm, and the sudden quiet was almost as deafening as the noise had been. Cora stood dripping on the floorboards, shivering, not from cold, but from the violent aftermath of her emotions. Ezra didn't hover. He didn't crowd her. He moved to the wooden chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out a thick, clean wool blanket. He didn't wrap it around her himself. He simply held it out, an offering, not an order. She took it, her hands trembling, and wrapped it around her own shoulders. The dry, rough wool smelled of wood smoke and him. He backed away, giving her space. He went to the fire, added another log, and poked at the embers, his movements deliberate and calm. He was letting her breathe. He was letting her come back to herself in her own time. He understood, with an instinct that went deeper than words, that the greatest kindness he could offer her now was not comfort, but distance. His respect for her was as clear and as warm as the fire blazing in the hearth. She stood there for a long time, the blanket clutched around her, watching the flames dance. The shivering subsided. Her breathing slowed. The frantic, hunted animal inside her was finally, blessedly still. He was at the table, his back to her, ostensibly checking the action on his rifle. But she knew he was just giving himself something to do, keeping his hands busy. She finally spoke, her voice a raw, shaky whisper, barely audible above the drumming of the rain on the roof. "Tell me something." He stopped moving, but he didn't turn around. "What?" She swallowed, the words a knot of fear in her throat. This was the last, most terrifying question, the one whose answer could save her or destroy her completely. "Am I just a distraction for you?" she whispered. "A stray dog you took in something to break the silence. Tell me I'm not just a distraction from your loneliness." For a long moment, he did not move. He just sat there, a broad, still silhouette against the firelight. Then, slowly, he set the rifle down on the table. He stood up and turned to face her. The firelight carved his face out of the shadows, highlighting the hard planes of his cheeks, the grim set of his mouth. He looked at her, his gaze direct and so intense it felt like a physical touch. He took one half step toward her, closing a small fraction of the respectful distance he had put between them. "No," he said, his voice low and certain, each word a stone dropped into a deep well. "You're not a distraction. Cora." He paused, and his expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes easing, replaced by a profound, solemn clarity she had never seen before. "Your peace." The word, his word for her, hung in the warm, fire-lit air. Peace. It was the one thing she had never known, the one thing she thought she could never be. He took another slow step. He was in front of her now, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He lifted his hand, the one that had been so gentle in the storm, and cupped her jaw. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, a rough, calloused, impossibly tender touch. He looked into her eyes, and in their depths, she did not see pity. She did not see desire as she had known it, as a hungry, taking thing. She saw a quiet, steady reverence. He was looking at her as if she were the first dawn after a long, hard winter. He lowered his head. It was not a sudden, passionate claiming. It was a slow, deliberate descent. She had 1,000 years to pull away, to turn her head, to say no. She did not move. She stood, rooted to the spot, her heart a wild, frantic bird in her chest. And then his lips touched hers. They were firm and warm and tasted faintly of coffee and rain. It was a kiss of profound stillness. It was not a kiss that took. It was a kiss that gave. It was a question and an answer, a promise and a vow, all without a single word. It was the sealing of a silent pact, a communication so deep it bypassed language entirely. She felt the tremor in his hand as he held her face, and she lifted her own hand, the one that was not bandaged, and rested it tentatively on his chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath the rough cotton of his shirt. It was a kiss that did not devour, but affirmed. It said, "You are here. You are safe. You are peace." When he finally lifted his head, the space between them was charged, electric, but the fear was gone. The rain outside had softened, its furious drumming easing into a gentle, rhythmic patter, a thin, silver curtain against the window pane. A small, watery, tentative smile touched Cora's lips. And in the flickering firelight, Ezra Vale, the hard, solitary man of Dry Lantern Ridge, smiled back. The morning broke with a fragile, liquid clarity. The storm had scoured the world, leaving behind a sky so deeply, purely blue it almost hurt to look at. The air was cool and thin, scrubbed clean of dust, carrying on it the scent of wet earth and the sharp, resinous perfume of the junipers. Inside the cabin, the light was pearlescent. Cora woke on her pallet by the hearth, the wool blanket still wrapped around her. She felt, for a moment, displaced, her body floating in the strange new quiet. Then, the memory of the night before rushed in the storm, the confession, the impossible, solid warmth of his kiss. Her eyes flew open. He was already awake. He was not in his bed, but standing by the open door, a tin mug of coffee in his hand, looking out at the clean-swept yard. He was just a dark shape against the blinding light, but she felt the change in him, the air in the room, which had always been his, now felt shared. The space between them was no longer a void of avoidance and respect. It was a charged, living current. She rose quietly, her body stiff but her mind strangely calm. The hunted animal inside her, which had been pacing and frantic for months, was finally, blessedly, still. He heard her movement and turned. His face was unreadable in the morning shadow, but he didn't look away. He didn't retreat to his work, and she didn't duck her head in deference. They just looked at each other for a long moment, acknowledging the new, unspoken treaty that existed between them. "The laundry," she said, her voice quiet. He nodded. She went outside, into the brilliant, cool morning. The sheet she had dropped in the mud during her panic was gone, likely washed away, but the clothes she had hung earlier, his blue shirts, her own mended dress, were still on the line. The storm had washed them again, violently, and the wind had beaten them dry. They snapped and billowed in the new, clean breeze, impossibly white against the deep blue of the sky. They were clean. Everything felt clean. She was taking them down, the cool, sun-baked cotton a comfort in her hands. When she heard it, the same sound that had first signaled her fear hoofbeats. But this was not the light, arrogant canter of Miles Hart's horse. It was a slow, plodding, steady gait, a mule. Cora froze. The white shirt clutched to her chest. A rider was coming up the track. He was a dark figure, clad in black, his mount slow and methodical. He stopped at the gate, and her heart hammered against her ribs. It was Reverend Gideon, the minister from Willow Gate. The town, the shame, it was all coming back. He had come to cast her out, to preach at Ezra, to bring the judgment of the town to their very doorstep. She looked wildly toward the cabin, her breath coming short. Ezra was already on the porch. He set his coffee mug down on the railing. He was not surprised. He was waiting. "Ezra," she whispered, backing toward the cabin, the clean laundry forgotten. What is he doing here?" Reverend Gideon, a thin man with a face carved from dry wood, dismounted, tied his mule to the gate, and walked into the yard, his black hat in his hands. "Mr. Vale," he said, his voice a dry, pastoral rustle. "You sent for me." Ezra nodded. "I did. Thank you for coming so quick." Cora felt the blood drain from her face. He sent for him. He had invited the judgment. He had called the town to witness her shame. She felt the kiss, the promise of peace, evaporate. It had all been a lie, a trick, a way to what? She came onto the porch, her eyes wide with betrayal.
Ezra, what have you done?
Ezra turned to face her. He blocked her from the Reverend's view, his body a solid wall. He looked down at her, his face grim, not with anger, but with that same unyielding resolve he'd had in the storm. "You're afraid of the shame. Cora," he asked, his voice low. "For her alone. You're afraid of the talk in town, the whispers from women like Mrs. Albright." She stammered, confused by his directness. "We end it," he said. The words were not a request. They were not a romantic plea. He spoke them like he was hammering nails into fresh-cut timber. "We end it, right now. We make it proper." Her mind reeled. She looked past him at the Reverend, who was politely studying the horizon, then back at Ezra's unmoving face. "Proper," she breathed. "You mean, marry?" "That's what I mean." The shock of it was so profound. She felt lightheaded. This was not a solution. It was a cage. He was trapping himself with her, shackling his good name to her ruined one, all to stop a few whispers in a town he barely visited.
"No,"
she said, her voice fierce, desperate. She grabbed the front of his shirt, the mended cloth she had stitched herself.
"No, Ezra, you can't. Not like this. Don't. Please, don't do this out of pity. Don't do this just to save me from gossip. I won't be a debt you have to pay. I won't be your burden."
He looked down at her hand, clamped on his chest, then back to her eyes. The idea of pity seemed to genuinely offend him. He put his large, calloused hand over hers, his grip enclosing her fingers, stilling their trembling. "Pity," he said, his voice rough. "I don't know that word. I'm not a man who runs on pity. Cora, I told you what you were." He waited, forcing her to meet his gaze, forcing her to remember. "I'm not doing this for the town," he said, his voice softening, but losing none of its iron. "I'm not doing it for shame. I'm doing it because you are my peace, and I aim to keep my peace right here." She stared at him, her throat thick with tears. But these were not tears of shame or fear. They were tears of a profound, shattering relief. He was not saving her from the world. He was choosing her, in spite of it. "Reverend," Ezra said, turning, his hand still covering hers on his chest. "We're ready." The ceremony was not in the cabin, and not in the yard. It was on the threshold, on the wide, scrubbed planks of the porch, with the clean, limitless sky as their cathedral and the open door of the house at their backs. It was a space that was neither the world's nor entirely private. It was the line between, the place where they had first met, the place where he had stood and watched the rain. The air was still cool, and a faint, sweet, purple scent drifted on the wind. Cora recognized it, surprised. A stubborn, wild lilac bush, hidden in a rocky cleft near the house, had bloomed after the storm, the scent of it of wet wood, clean rain, and improbable flowers wrapped around them. Reverend Gideon stood before them, his Bible open, his words a strange, formal intrusion on their quiet world. There was no ring of gold. Ezra was not a man for such things. As the Reverend began to speak, Ezra released her hand. He took the small, sharp knife from his belt. Cora's breath hitched, the old fear flickering, but he just turned to a piece of clean, strong leather tack hanging from a peg. With 2 quick, precise movements, he cut 2 thin, identical strips. He looped one into a small, simple circle and handed it to her. He held out his left hand for the other. "The ring," the Reverend prompted, "is a symbol of a covenant." Ezra just looked at Cora. His eyes never left her face. When the time came, she slipped the rough leather loop onto his 4th finger. It looked stark and strange and powerful against his calloused skin. He did the same for her, his large fingers, which could gentle a horse and shape hot iron, were surprisingly steady as he slid the ring onto her finger. It was not a jewel. It was a promise. It was a brand. It tied her to him, to this land, to this life. Do you, Ezra Vale, take this woman, Cora Linden, to be your lawfully wedded wife? Ezra didn't hesitate. I do. The words were curt, strong, a bedrock foundation. Do you, Cora Linden, take this man? She looked at Ezra, at this hard, quiet man who had shared his silence with her, who had bandaged her hand, who had stood for her against the town, who had called her his peace.
I do,
she whispered, her voice shaking but clear as the morning air. The Reverend closed his book. By the authority vested in me by God and the territory, I pronounce you man and wife. Ezra did not kiss her. Not then, not in front of another. He simply took her hand, the one with the new leather ring, and squeezed it once. The contract was sealed. Reverend Gideon stayed for a cup of coffee. He was a practical man, and he understood the frontier. He signed the paper that made it legal, accepted a small bag of beans for his trouble, and mounted his mule. God bless this house, Mrs. Vale, he said to Cora. The name was a shock, a strange, new garment that didn't quite fit. She just nodded, her face burning. They stood on the porch, side by side, and watched him ride away until he was just a black speck disappearing into the vast, blue distance. The sound of the mule's hooves faded, and the silence of the ranch rushed back in. It was a new silence. It was heavier, more permanent. They went inside. The cabin was exactly the same. A bed, a table, a chair, a hearth. But everything had changed. The air was thick with the unsaid. Cora, needing to do something with her hands, went to the stove to heat the coffee pot. Ezra stood by the window, staring out. The small, ticking clock on the mantel, which had been a quiet companion, now seemed to hammer the seconds into the room. Tick-tock, man, wife. She poured 2 cups. She set one at his usual place at the table, and she set the second one directly across from it, not on the porch steps, not at the far end. 2 cups, together. She looked at the table, at the 2 cups waiting, and her shoulders began to shake. Ezra turned from the window. He saw the cups. He saw her. Cora. She looked up at him. Her eyes flooded. I thought, she whispered, her hand finding the leather ring on her finger, twisting it. When I was running, I thought I'd never have a home again. I thought that part of me was dead. Ezra was quiet for a long time. He crossed the room, slow and deliberate, and stood beside her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a warmth, a solid wall. He looked down at the 2 cups, at the table, at the clean-swept floor. You built this one, he said, his voice rough. This was just a place I slept. You came, you mended the clothes, you put food on the table, you made it quiet. He looked at her. You built it. Cora. She leaned her head, just slightly, resting it against his shoulder. He did not stiffen. He did not move. He just stood there, a solid presence, and let her rest. For the first time, she was not a stray, not a guest, not a refugee. She was home. The peace lasted through the day. It was a deep, settled quiet, the fragile, hopeful beginning of a new life. But the world outside did not care for new lives. That evening, as the sun was bleeding red into the western hills, Ezra took his rifle and went for his usual walk around the perimeter of his land. It was a habit born of a lifetime of solitude, checking for dangers, for wolves, for breaks in the fence. The storm had washed the ground clean. The mud had hardened in the sun, leaving a perfect, pristine crust. Any track, any disturbance would be as clear as print on a new page. He found nothing near the house, nothing near the corral, but down by the south fence line, far from the road, hidden in a shallow arroyo that offered cover. He found it. A boot print? It was not his. His boots were worn in the heel. This one was worn in the toe. It was large, deep, made by a heavy man who had stood there, watching for a very long time. It was a fresh print, made after the rain had stopped. Someone had been on his land, watching the cabin, watching her. A cold, hard anger settled in Ezra's gut. The shadow of her past, or perhaps the new shadow of Miles' heart, was long, and it was reaching for his home. He erased the print with his own boot, his movements sharp and angry. He turned back toward the cabin, his eyes scanning the darkening ridges, the rifle held in a low, ready grip. As he passed the corral, the gray mare, the stubborn, half-wild one he had gentled with his voice, suddenly lifted her head from the hay. She stared hard into the southern darkness, her ears pinned flat, her muscles tensed, and she let out a low, vibrating snort, biting at the air, stamping a hoof. She smelled it, the stranger, the risk. Ezra stopped, his hand on the top rail, soothing her. "I know, girl," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I know." He walked back to the cabin, where the lamp was lit, a single, warm, yellow square in the vast, gathering dark. He saw Cora's shadow move past the window. His peace. He went inside, bolted the door, and laid his rifle not in the corner, but on the table, where it was close at hand. The wedding was over. The fight to keep what he had just claimed had only begun. The bolted door was a new comfort. The rifle, resting on the table instead of by the door, was a new, shared reality. For 3 nights. Cora had slept on her pallet and Ezra in his bed, the space between them defined by the leather ring on her finger. It was a chaste, profound quiet, the peace of a truce signed after a long war. And in the deepest hour of that 3rd night, the peace was shattered. Crack! The sound was sharp, definitive, splitting the dark. It was not thunder. It was a rifle, fired from a distance. Ezra was out of the bed before the echo died, his feet hitting the floorboards with a solid, familiar thud. He didn't light the lamp. Cora was sitting up, her heart a cold stone in her chest. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl. He was already pulling his boots on. Then, a new sound, a low, subterranean rumble that vibrated up through the floor. It was not an echo. It was 1,000 pounds of hoof and horn. A low, terrified bellow confirmed it. "He's at the herd," Ezra snarled. He grabbed the rifle from the table. "They've spooked them. They're running them." "I'm coming!" She was already on her feet, pulling on her own worn boots. "No, you stay. Bolt the door behind me." "You can't see in the dark," she said, her voice as flat and hard as his. "You need the light." She snatched the heavy storm lantern from its hook. He looked at her in the gloom, at the set of her jaw, the determination in her stance. This was not the trembling woman he had pulled from the mud. This was Mrs. Vale. He gave a single, curt nod. "Stay by the gate at the Silver Wolf pasture. Open it if I turn them back. Shut it if they run past. Do not get in their way. Understand?" "I understand," she said. He was out the door in a second, sprinting for the corral. The roan neighed in protest. Cora lit the lantern, the wick catching with a small whoosh, and the yellow light threw their frantic, giant shadows against the cabin wall. She grabbed the mule, which was easier to saddle in the dark, and followed him. The ride to Silver Wolf Fork, their best grazing pasture, was a nightmare of plunging shadows. Ezra rode ahead, a dark phantom on his fast horse. Cora clung to the mule, the lantern held high, its light a small, bouncing, valiant circle in the oppressive, roaring dark. The air smelled of dust and ozone, and beneath it, the hot, metallic scent of animal panic. They reached the crest of the ridge. The pasture lay below, a wide, shallow bowl, and it was alive. The herd, 60 head of prime cattle, was a single, surging black river of terror. They were running, not from a wolf, but from a gunshot, pouring toward a break in the fence.
"The gate! Cora!"
Ezra yelled.
"To the gate!"
He spurred the roan, plunging down the hill, angling to get ahead of the lead steers, to turn the stampede before they scattered across the open plains, or, worse, drove themselves into the deep, rocky arroyos to the east. Cora kicked the mule, her teeth rattling. She reached the pasture gate. It was still standing, but the fence line to the left, it was down, smashed. Someone had taken an axe to the posts. She slid off the mule, her hands shaking, but not with fear, with rage. She held the lantern as high as she could. Its light cut a wide, yellow swath, and it caught him. On the far ridge, outlined against the stars, was the man from the arroyo. The boot print. He was just sitting on his horse, watching. A big man, solid as a boulder, his purpose clear. He was not just spooking the herd, he was scattering Ezra's entire future, his livelihood, across the desert. Ezra saw him, too. He reined in for a half-second, and his voice carried back to her a single, ripped word. Rourke. Cora's blood went cold. Deacon Rourke, the name she had heard whispered in town, the man who bought debts, the man who had sent Miles Hart to poison their name. The rumors hadn't worked. The town's shame hadn't driven her out. So now he was using force. He was breaking their fences, running their stock. Ezra didn't waste another second on the man. He went back to the work, charging the roan straight at the head of the stampede. He was a magnificent, terrifying rider, his body low over the horse's neck, his voice a raw roar, trying to turn the massive, terrified lead steer. He was almost there. He was pushing the steer, turning it. And then the ground, soft from the storm, betrayed him. A smaller steer, blind with panic, slammed into the roan's side. The horse stumbled, its legs buckling. Ezra fought for balance, but the momentum was too much. He was thrown. He went down hard, disappearing beneath the churning, dusty wave of bodies. Ezra. Cora's scream was a knife in the night, lost in the thunder of hooves. She stood frozen for one single, agonizing second. He was gone. The man who had called her peace was about to be trampled into the mud by his own herd. The herd, now leaderless, swerved. They were no longer heading for the open plains. They were thundering directly toward her, toward the open gate. The Cora Linden who had arrived at Dry Lantern Ridge would have run. She would have climbed a tree, hidden in the rocks, saved herself. Cora Vale stood her ground. She looked to her left, a deep, dry wash in arroyo, its mouth a dark, gaping shadow. It was a natural trap. She looked at the thundering wall of horns and terror coming at her. She saw Ezra, 100 yards away, staggering to his feet. He was alive, but he was limping, his arm hanging useless at his side. He would never get to his horse in time. She had no gun, no horse, only a lantern, a mule, and a broken piece of the gate. Rage, cold and pure, burned away the last vestiges of her fear. She snatched up the heavy timber that had served as the gate's crossbar, shattered by Rourke's men. It was heavy, a log of solid juniper. The lead steer was 50 yards away. She grabbed the lantern in her left hand, the heavy timber in her right. She did not run away. She ran at them. She ran straight at the face of the stampede, screaming, a high, piercing wail that was more animal than human. She stopped at the edge of the wash, planting her feet in the mud, and she became a fury. She swung the lantern in a wide, blinding arc, and she slammed the heavy log against a large granite boulder at the arroyo's edge. Clang! The sound was immense, a hollow, echoing boom that was louder than a gunshot. The lead steer, its eyes rolling white, saw the light, the screaming, demonic motion, and heard the terrifying, unnatural sound. It swerved. Clang! She hit the rock again. All her strength, all her rage, all her terror focused into that single, violent act. The steer swerved hard left. It plunged, bellowing, into the dark mouth of the dry wash. And where the leader goes, the herd follows. They poured past her, a river of hot, snorting, terrified bodies. So close she felt the wind of their passing. They didn't even see her. They just followed the steer in front, plunging headlong into the arroyo. Clang, clang, clang. She kept hitting the rock, a frantic, desperate rhythm, part woman, part machine, her arms burning, her throat raw from screaming, until the last panicked calf stumbled past her into the trap. The thunder faded, muffled by the high earthen walls of the wash. Silence. The only sound was her own gasping breath and the tink, tink, tink of the hot lantern in her shaking hand. She saw him then. Ezra had caught his horse. He was riding toward her, his face a pale, ghostly mask in the lantern light. He rode up, not to her, but to the mouth of the arroyo. He looked in. The herd was bunched, confused, but contained, safe. He turned in the saddle and just looked at her. He was covered in mud. His left arm was clamped to his side, his face tight with a pain that went beyond words. But his eyes, even in the darkness, were filled with a raw, stunned awe. They worked for the next 2 hours. The sun was a sick gray promise in the east before they were done. Ezra, working one-handed, his face sweating with the effort, helped her drag boulders and the broken timbers to form a crude but effective barrier across the mouth of the wash. The herd was theirs. They had held. The walk back to the cabin was silent, a grim march of exhaustion and pain. Ezra leaned heavily in his saddle, his face ashen. When they reached the cabin, Cora slid from the mule, her legs like water. She lit the main lamp, and the small room flooded with warm, yellow light. "Let me see," she said. Ezra slumped into the chair at the table, the one he had declared hers. He grunted, his teeth clamped shut, as he tried to pull his shirt off. He couldn't. "The knife," she said. She took the small blade from his belt and, with a steady hand, slit the mended blue shirt from cuff to collar, cutting away the fabric. She gasped. It wasn't a simple break. The fall had driven him onto a sharp rock. His shoulder was a raw, gaping tear, a deep gouge that pulsed dark blood with every beat of his heart. He was watching her. "It's bad," he stated. It needs cleaning and stitches." "Ezra." He nodded. "The whiskey and your sewing kit, the one you use for my shirts." She moved with a calm she didn't know she possessed. She brought the bottle, the fine needle, the dark thread. She poured a splash of the burning liquid into a bowl, then a splash onto a clean rag. She began to clean the wound. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, his whole body going rigid, but he did not pull away. This will hurt, Ezra," she whispered, her voice trembling, but her hands were not. He looked at the mending basket. He pulled out a thick strip of scrap linen, folded it, and put it between his teeth. "Go on," he mumbled around the cloth. She threaded the needle, her fine, practiced stitches. She dipped the needle and the length of thread into the whiskey, the alcohol stinging the air. She met his eyes. He did not close them. He did not look away. He did not brace his head against the table. He fixed his gaze directly on her. His eyes, dark with pain, held a terrifying, absolute, and unconditional trust. He was giving her his flesh, his strength, placing it entirely in her small, steady hands. She took a deep breath. She pushed the needle in. His body went rigid as a board. A low, animal sound forced from his throat, muffled by the cloth. His knuckles on the table went white, but his eyes never left her. They stared into hers. A silent, desperate communication. "I trust you. Do not falter." And she did not. Her hand was rock steady. The needle moved with the same fluid. Practiced grace she had used on his shirt. In, out, a neat, tight, perfect seam. She was not a panicked refugee. She was not a trembling girl. She was a wife, mending her husband, stitching their life back together. One painful, precise stitch at a time. When she was done, she tied the knot and cut the thread. Her hands were finally shaking, the reaction flooding her. She wrapped the wound tightly with clean bandages. He spat the wadded soaked cloth onto the table. He was pale as death, a sheen of cold sweat on his forehead, but his voice was steady. "Good work," he rasped. The news came 2 days later. Ezra was healing, but he was a caged, one-armed lion, furious at his own weakness. Cora was running the ranch, feeding the stock, her body aching, but her mind clear. Jedediah Smith, their closest neighbor from 10 miles south, rode in. He was an old, whip-thin man with honest eyes, and he respected Ezra. "Ezra," he said, accepting a cup of coffee at the porch. "Figured you should know, the wind from town ain't good." "Rourke," Ezra said. It wasn't a question. "Aye, he was at the land office. He bought up the banknote on the Miller place. Foreclosed yesterday. Millers are out." Cora, standing in the doorway, felt a chill. "That ain't all," Jedediah said, lowering his voice. "He's been asking after the title on the old Bar T, and he's put in an offer on my debt. A high one." The plan was suddenly, terribly clear. It wasn't just Ezra. Rourke was buying the paper on every small, struggling ranch in the valley. He was consolidating. He would control the land, the water, everything. He was a snake, encircling them all, preparing for a single, legal squeeze. Dry Lantern Ridge was just the last, most stubborn piece. When Jedediah left, a grim silence settled on the porch. "He'll strangle us," Ezra said, his good hand clenching and unclenching on the railing. "He'll do it all with paper. He'll use the law. He'll call in the notes, and we'll all be gone by spring. It's legal." Cora stepped out, standing beside him. She looked out at the clean, harsh land she had just fought for. She had been a victim of fists. She had been a victim of whispers. This was a new kind of violence, a quiet, ink and paper kind, but it was violence all the same. "He uses whispers to make people afraid," she said, her voice quiet, but cold as the water in the well. "He uses force to break things." She laid her hand gently on his bandaged shoulder. "And he uses ledgers to make it all seem right." She turned to face him, her eyes, once so haunted, now clear and sharp as flint. "He thinks he's clean," she said, "but men who deal in that much dirt always have it under their fingernails. He's made mistakes. Ezra, he has to have." He looked at her, startled by the steel in her voice. "We can't fight him with rifles," she said. "That's what he wants. Another stampede, another broken fence, until you do something he can call the law on. We can't fight him with fists." She looked down at her own hands, the ones that had held a needle and a log. "We fight him with his own weapon," she said. "He wants to use paper. We'll use paper. We'll find the dirt he's hidden. We'll find the cheat, the lie, the one line in his perfect ledger that isn't true." Ezra stared at her, a new, slow-burning hope dawning in his eyes. This was not the woman he had saved. This was the woman who had just saved him. "It's time," Cora Vale said, her voice low and steady, "to bring that dirty man into the light." The new war was a quiet one, fought not with rifles but with whispers and ink. The battlefield was the 10-mile ride to Willow Gate, and Cora Vale was its soul, determined soldier. She rode in not as a refugee, but as a rancher's wife, a title that felt both as strange and as solid as the leather ring on her finger. She had a purpose. She was not there to beg or to hide. She was there to hunt. Her strategy was one of patient observation. She became a regular, unremarkable presence at the mercantile. She bought salt, sugar, coffee, small necessities that gave her a reason to be there. Mrs. Albright's demeanor had not softened. It was still a wall of icy, pious disapproval, but business was business. Cora paid in coin and did not flinch from the woman's gaze. She learned to listen, while waiting for Mrs. Albright to weigh out her goods. She'd linger by the dry goods, her head bent as if studying the different grades of flour, but her ears were open. She heard the names of men who worked for Rourke, the gossip about his land acquisitions, the quiet fear that was beginning to curdle the town's air. Her break came on her third visit. Rourke's foreman, a burly man named Colby, was at the counter, buying a massive order of supplies, everything from blasting powder to barrels of salted beef. He was loud and arrogant, treating Mrs. Albright with a casual disdain that made her thin lips press into a white line. In his haste and arrogance, he left the supply ledger open on the counter when he went to load his wagon. Cora, waiting to pay for a spool of thread, saw her chance. She moved to the counter, placing her coins beside the open book. Her heart was a cold, hard hammer in her chest, but her hands were steady. As Mrs. Albright turned to make change, Cora's eyes scanned the open page. It was Rourke's account, a long list of debits. And then she saw it. Payments, laborers, Southridge Line. There were 12 names listed, and next to one of them, a familiar scrawl, T. Blevins. Tom Blevins, a name from another life, another town. A man who had worked for her father before drink and dishonesty had seen him run off. But more than that, a man who had died of a fever 2 years ago. She had been at his pauper's funeral. Rourke was paying a ghost, and if he was paying one, he was likely paying more. It was a classic, heavy-handed fraud padding his payroll, writing off the expenses, and pocketing the cash. It was the kind of arrogant, lazy crime a man who believed himself untouchable would commit. She memorized the page number, the date, the name. She took her change and her thread, gave Mrs. Albright a polite, neutral nod, and walked out, her mind a whirlwind of cold, clear calculation. That night, she laid out her plan for Ezra. He sat at the table, his bandaged shoulder propped on a pillow, his face grim in the lamplight as he listened. "He's cheating his own books," she said, her voice a low, intense hum. "If he's doing it for labor, he's doing it for supplies, for everything. He's building a phantom empire to justify his costs and hide his profits. It's his word against ours." "Cora," Ezra said, his voice a gravelly note of caution. "A dead man's name in a ledger ain't proof enough for a judge." "It is if it's part of a pattern," she insisted. "But you're right. We need more than just his weakness. We need our own strength. We need to get out from under his thumb, completely." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. "The herd. The yearlings are ready for sale. Rourke controls the local buyers, the stockyards in the next county. Every rancher here sells to his men." "It's the only way," Ezra agreed. "There's no other market." "Yes, there is," she said, her eyes bright with a fierce, strategic light. "When I was in town, I heard some men in the saloon talking. The army is building up the garrison at Fort Laramie. They need beef, hundreds of head. They pay in government script, and they don't use local brokers because they don't trust them." Ezra stared at her. The idea was audacious. Fort Laramie was a long, hard drive away. It was a gamble, but it was a gamble that took Rourke completely out of the equation. "They won't just buy from anyone," he said, the idea taking root. "They have standards, a quartermaster." "Then we meet them," she said, her voice ringing with a confidence that startled them both. "You and I. We go to the fort. We make our case." And so they began to rehearse. For the next week, the small cabin became their training ground. They pushed the table against the wall, and Ezra, his shoulders still stiff but his strength returning, would stand in the center of the room, practicing his pitch. I am Ezra Vale of Dry Lantern Ridge. He would begin, his voice rough and unaccustomed to such formal speech. My stock is Hereford Cross, strong bloodline. They're grass-fed, on the high plains, good water, they're hardy. They'll make the drive north without losing a pound. He spoke of muscle, of bone, of the practical, tangible quality of his life's work. Then, it was Cora's turn. While he spoke of the beef, she spoke of the books. She had taken his few, scattered notes and transformed them into a proper ledger.
"Quartermaster?"
she'd say, her voice clear and steady, holding up the book she had filled with her neat, precise script.
"This is our herd roll. Every head is accounted for. We've had no sickness, no fever, no rot. This is our grazing log, showing our pasture rotation, clean grass, clean water. You won't find a healthier herd this side of the territories."
She was the mind, he was the body. She was the paper, he was the earth. Together, they were a formidable, undeniable team. He would look at her during these rehearsals, a slow, deep pride dawning in his eyes. This was the woman who had charged a stampede. This was the woman who was now charging an army. The night before they were to leave for the fort, a deep quiet settled over the ranch. The plan was set. Jedediah Smith had agreed to watch their land while they were gone. The small herd of yearlings was gathered in the corral, ready. The cabin was warm, the fire in the hearth burning low, casting long, dancing shadows. They sat not at the table, but on the floor, on a blanket before the flames, a shared cup of coffee between them. The rifle was back in its place by the door.
"Are you afraid?"
Cora asked, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet. Ezra was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. "Not of the ride," he said finally. "Not of the quartermaster, not even of Rourke." He turned to look at her, his face open and vulnerable in the firelight. "I'm afraid," he said, his voice low and raw, "of failing this, of losing this." He gestured around the small, simple room. "I was good at being alone. It was easy. I knew the rules. But you built a home in here, Cora, and I don't know how to lose a home. I'm afraid of failing you." The confession was a stone dropped into the quiet pool of her heart. She saw the deep, lonely fear behind his strength, the terror of having something to lose for the first time in his life. "And you?" he asked. She looked down at her hands, at the faint, silvery scars from the burn, at the leather ring on her finger. "I'm not afraid of him hurting me anymore," she whispered. "My deepest fear is that I brought this all on you, that my past is a storm, and I dragged you into it. I'm afraid that one day you'll look at the ruin, and you'll wish you'd never opened that gate." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "Never," he said, his voice a bedrock certainty. He drew her closer. They sat there, side by side, watching the embers glow, their deepest fears laid bare in the warm, safe dark. The last walls between them had finally, irrevocably, crumbled. He leaned in, and she lifted her face to him. He rested his forehead against hers. It was an act of profound intimacy, a silent sharing of thoughts, of fears, of a future. She closed her eyes, breathing in his scent of leather and wood smoke and the clean, cold night. A small smile touched her lips, and she felt him smile in return. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, anchoring kiss of the storm, nor the formal seal of their wedding. This was a kiss of deep, quiet, and complete knowing. It was slow and gentle and absolute. She brought her other hand up to cup his jaw, feeling the rough stubble, the strong line of his bone. His hand moved from her hand to the small of her back, drawing her in, not with force, but with an invitation. The fire popped, a shower of orange sparks dancing up the chimney. The window pane, cold from the night air, began to fog with the warmth of their breath. Their hands, which had fought and mended and worked, now intertwined, fingers locking together in a simple, perfect knot. The last thing seen was the flickering firelight, casting their two joined shadows as one against the wall, before the shadows deepened and the room was left to the quiet, sacred dark. She woke to the pale gray light of dawn. She was not on her pallet. She was in his bed, wrapped in his arms, her head on his shoulder. The heavy wool blanket covered them both. For the first time, she had not slept the light, shallow sleep of the hunted. She had slept the deep, peaceful, dreamless sleep of the safe. There was no awkwardness. There was no shame. There was only a profound, settled calm. She turned her head slightly and saw he was already awake, watching her. His face, in the soft morning light, was stripped of all its hardness. It was just the face of a man at peace. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Mornin', Mrs. Vale." "Mornin', Mr. Vale," she whispered back. Their union had not been a frantic collision of passion. It had been a quiet, inevitable arrival. They were not two broken pieces trying to make a whole. They were two solitary souls who had, against all odds, built a home together. Later that morning, while Ezra made the final preparations for their journey, Cora sat at the table with pen and paper. With a steady hand, she copied the fraudulent entries from Rourke's ledger onto a clean sheet of paper, her memory of the page exact. She wrote a short, anonymous letter, its language simple and direct. To the Honorable Judge Miller, men of property have a duty to be honest. Deacon Rourke is not. Ask him about the men he pays who are already in the ground. A concerned citizen. She sealed it, and on her way to Jedediah's to drop off the spare keys, she left it with a freight driver heading to the county seat, with a coin to ensure its delivery. The first seed of Rourke's downfall had been planted. They were about to ride out, the yearlings already moving up the track, when a lone rider approached. It was Miles Hart. He did not ride with his old arrogance. He sat slumped in his saddle, his fine clothes looking worn, his polished boots caked with dust. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from the gate, his face a mask of shame and fear. "Vale," he said, his voice hoarse. "Ma'am." He actually nodded at Cora. "What do you want?" "Hart," Ezra said, his hand resting near the rifle in his saddle scabbard. I come to warn you," Miles stammered. "Rourke, he's not right. He heard you were taking the herd to Laramie. It made him crazy. He says if he can't have your ranch, no one can." Cora moved her mule forward, her expression calm and unreadable. "Get to the point. Mr. Hart," she said. Miles swallowed, looking at her with a new, grudging respect. "He's sending Colby and another man tonight. After you're gone, they're going to burn your hay barn, burn it to the ground, leave you with nothing to feed your stock for the winter." Ezra's hand tightened on his rifle, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Cora held up a hand, stopping him. She looked at Miles, her eyes cold and clear. "And why are you telling us this, looking for a reward?" "No, ma'am," he said, shaking his head miserably. He cast me off, said I was useless. I got nothing. I never signed on for that, for burning a man's life down." He looked genuinely wretched. "I just wanted to warn you." Cora was silent for a long moment. The old Cora would have seen a threat. The new Cora saw an opportunity. "Thank you for the warning, Mr. Hart," she said, her voice even. "We appreciate it." She then looked him straight in the eye. "Atonement isn't an apology. Mr. Hart, it's an action. When the time comes, Judge Miller may have some questions for a man who used to work for Deacon Rourke, a man who might know about certain names in a ledger. Your testimony could be very valuable." She let the words hang in the air. She wasn't offering him forgiveness. She was offering him a chance to earn it, a path that served them both. Miles Hart stared at her, then at Ezra, and a flicker of understanding, of a way out, dawned in his tired eyes. He nodded, a single, jerky motion. "When the time comes," he said. He turned his horse and rode away. Not a villain, but just a small, broken man caught in a bigger game. Cora turned to Ezra. The trip to Fort Laramie was off.
"He's not burning our hay,"
she said, her voice ringing with the cold, hard certainty of a blacksmith's hammer striking an anvil. The plan shifted. The trap was no longer in a ledger. It was here, at home. They would send the yearlings to Jedediah's pasture for safekeeping. They would wait in the darkness. They would catch Rourke's men in the act. And thanks to her anonymous letter, when they sent for the law, the judge would already be asking his own questions. The fire Rourke intended to set would not be the one that consumed them. It would be the one that illuminated his own crimes for the world to see. The darkness that fell over Dry Lantern Ridge was not a blanket. It was a hunter's blind. Every shadow was a waiting place. Every gust of wind a held breath. The moon was a sliver, hiding behind a veil of high, thin clouds, offering no aid. Inside the cabin, the lamp was extinguished. Cora and Ezra sat in the dark, not on the floor by the fire, but at the table. Two still figures in the gloom. The rifle was in Ezra's hands, his left arm, though still bandaged, strong enough to support the stock. Cora's hand rested on a heavy, iron cowbell she had taken from the barn, its clapper muffled by a piece of cloth. They were not alone. Hidden in the deep shadows of the corral, in the dark maw of the smithy, behind the long, low shape of the water trough. A dozen men were waiting. Jedediah Smith was there, his old Sharps rifle across his knees. The Miller boys, their faces hard with the memory of their lost home. Were there other ranchers, men who had felt the cold touch of Rourke's shadow? They were an army of ghosts, summoned by a quiet ride from Ezra, united by a shared, simmering resentment. The weight stretched. The ticking of the clock in the cabin was a slow, methodical drumbeat, measuring the approach of violence. Every rustle of a leaf, every distant cry of a coyote sent a jolt through the taut silence. Cora's hand did not tremble on the bell. The fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But it was not the frantic, skittering fear of the hunted. It was the focused, icy fear of the soldier before a battle. She looked at Ezra. She could not see his face in the dark, but she could feel the absolute stillness of him, the coiled, patient readiness of a predator. He was no longer a man defending a shelter. He was a man defending his home, his peace. Then, a sound. The soft, deliberate snip of a wire cutter on the far fence. They were here. Two shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness of the plains. They moved with a practiced stealth, keeping low, their boots making almost no sound on the damp earth. One was Colby, Rourke's burly foreman. The other was a lean, wiry man whose face was lost to the night. They carried no lanterns. They moved directly, confidently, toward the hay barn. Cora watched them through the clean glass of the window. She saw Colby pull a coil of thick rope from his shoulder. He handed one end to the other man, and she saw the dark, wet sheen on it. Even in the faint starlight, oil. They reached the side of the barn, a massive structure filled with the sweet-smelling, tinder-dry wealth of a year's hard labor. It was Ezra's winter, his herd's survival, his future. Colby's partner produced a match. He struck it on his boot heel. The small flare of light was a sudden, violent intrusion in the dark. It illuminated his face, a mean, rat-like visage, and the determined, ugly set of Colby's jaw as he held the oil-soaked rope against the dry timber of the barn wall. The rat-faced man shielded the flame with his hand, lowering it to the rope. Cora ripped the cloth from the cowbell's clapper. She did not just ring it. She shook it with all her strength. A frantic, clanging, brazen alarm that shattered the night, a sound of pure, unholy clamor. The effect was instantaneous. The rat-faced man yelped. Dropping the lit match, Colby spun around, his hand flying to the pistol at his hip. And from every shadow, The ghosts rose. Jedediah Smith stepped out from behind the corral, the long barrel of his sharps glinting. The Miller boys appeared from the smithy, shotguns held at a low, ready angle. Men rose from the earth, surrounding the two arsonists. The metallic click-clack of a dozen rifles being cocked the only sound in the sudden, ringing silence after the bell. Colby and his partner froze, their faces turning a sickly, pale green in the faint light. They were trapped. The trap had been sprung. "Evening, Colby!" Ezra's voice boomed from the porch. He and Cora stepped out, Ezra holding the rifle, Cora standing beside him, her hand still gripping the bell. "Looks like you're lost." Colby's eyes darted around. From face to grim face, he was a bull, but he was a bull in a pen of wolves. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by the raw, animal sweat of fear. "Now, Vale, hold on," he stammered. "This is just a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," a new voice cut in, "is that you thought you could get away with it." The voice came from the track. A new group of riders was entering the yard. But this was not an army of ranchers. This was the law. A tall, silver-haired man on a fine gray horse, Judge Miller, and beside him, a stout, grim-faced deputy, his badge catching a glint of starlight. Colby's face crumpled. It was over. But it wasn't. From the darkness behind the judge, another man rode forward. A big man, solid as a boulder, his face a mask of incandescent fury. It was Deacon Rourke. He had not sent his men. He had come to watch his victory. And he had ridden straight into his own execution. "What is the meaning of this, Judge?" Rourke bellowed, his voice accustomed to command. "These men are trespassing on my prospective property." "It's not your property, Deacon," Judge Miller said, his voice as dry and thin as old paper. "And I'm here because of a letter that made some very interesting claims about your bookkeeping, claims about paying dead men." Rourke's face went rigid. His eyes darted to Ezra, then to Cora, and a look of pure, venomous hatred settled there. He had been outmaneuvered. "Lies," he spat. "The word of a desperate man and his whore." "No," a shaky voice said from the edge of the circle. A new figure stepped into the dim light. It was Miles Hart. He was pale and trembling, but he stood tall. "It ain't lies, Judge," Miles said, his voice ringing with the clarity of a desperate confession. "I was there. I saw the books. He's been doing it for years. Tom Blevins, a man named Sykes, a half-dozen others. Ghosts on the payroll." He pointed a shaking finger at Rourke. "He sent me here to spread lies about this woman. He paid me to poison the town against them. And the dead orders, the ones he used on the Miller place, the one he was using to squeeze Jedediah, they're forgeries. He pads the interest, adds fees that don't exist. He showed me how." Every word was a nail in Rourke's coffin. He was ruined. The whispers, the paper, the force, it had all been turned back on him. He was a snake eating its own tail. And he was cornered. And a cornered snake will always strike. His face contorted into a mask of pure, nihilistic rage. He was not a businessman anymore. He was just a raw, exposed nerve of hate, with a guttural roar. He ripped the pistol from his holster. "If I'm going down," he screamed, "I'm taking you with me." He swung the gun toward Ezra. Time seemed to slow, to stretch. Ezra didn't raise his rifle. He was too close. Instead, he moved forward. A single, explosive step. As Rourke's pistol came up, Ezra brought his good right arm around in a short, brutal arc. He didn't grab the gun. He slammed the heel of his hand, hard, against the pistol's long barrel. The impact was a dull, sickening thud. The gun was knocked sideways, its shot firing harmlessly into the night sky with a deafening crack. At the exact same instant, the rat-faced man, seeing his chance in the chaos, snatched up the match he had dropped. He struck it again, his eyes wild, intent on finishing the job. But Cora was moving. Too, she was not a wife hiding behind her husband. She was a partner. As the match flared, she launched herself forward. She didn't slap at his hand. She drew her foot back and kicked, her worn boot connecting squarely with his wrist. The match flew from his fingers, a tiny, arcing comet of fire, and landed directly on a pile of loose straw that had spilled from the barn door. Whoosh! The flame didn't just catch, it erupted. A wall of fire, no bigger than a man, sprang to life, licking at the dry, ancient wood of the barn. Rourke, his gun hand numb and useless, stared at the fire, a mad, triumphant grin spreading across his face. "Burn," he hissed. "Burn it all." Cora didn't hesitate. To her left was a rain barrel, full from the storm. She grabbed the heavy wooden bucket beside it, plunged it in, and hauled it out, sloshing with water. She was a whirlwind of motion. Her focus narrowed to a single point: the fire. Ezra saw a new danger. The flame, reaching for the low-hanging eaves, had weakened an old, dry roof beam. It groaned, a splintering, tearing sound. "Cora, get back!" he yelled. She threw the water. It hit the base of the fire in a great, hissing cloud of steam, but she was too close. The beam was giving way right above her. Ezra lunged. He grabbed her around the waist, his powerful arm a steel band, and hauled her backward, pulling her off her feet. They fell together in a tangle of limbs, hitting the dirt just as the heavy, smoldering beam crashed down exactly where she had been standing, sending a shower of sparks into the night. The fight was over. The deputy, his own gun drawn, shoved Rourke to his knees. The satisfying, final click of iron handcuffs closing around Rourke's wrists echoed in the sudden, stunned silence. Colby and the rat-faced man, their will broken, put their hands in the air. Rourke's other men, who had been waiting in the wings, melted back into the darkness. The fire, doused by Cora's quick action, was already dying. A sullen smoking patch on the barn wall. The crisis had passed. And now, the reckoning. The yard was crowded. The ranchers who had hidden in the shadows were now standing in the open, their rifles held loosely. They were no longer ghosts. They were witnesses. And from the track, drawn by the sound of the gunshot, more figures were arriving, people from the town, neighbors who had heard the commotion. The jury was assembled. Cora stood up, pushing her hair out of her eyes, a smudge of soot across her cheek. She stood straight, her back to the smoking barn, and faced them all. She faced the Millers, Jedediah, Mrs. Albright, who had just arrived, her face a mask of shock and confusion. She faced the whispers, the judgment, the shame. She did not speak. She did not need to. She did not offer an explanation or an apology. The truth was laid bare in the yard for all to see: a cuffed land baron, a confessed liar, a smoking barn wall, and a dozen honest men with rifles in their hands. The whispers of the town died. The stares of disapproval turned into looks of shame, of dawning, horrified respect. They had not seen a fallen woman. They had seen a homesteader defending her land. They had seen a wife defending her husband. They had seen, with their own eyes, the truth. Cora Vale stood tall in the silence, her shoulders back, her head high. She had not been vindicated by their approval. She had been vindicated by her own actions. Ezra pushed himself to his feet, his shoulders screaming in protest. But he ignored it. He looked at her. He saw the soot on her cheek, the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. He saw the woman who had faced down a stampede, who had stitched his flesh, who had kicked a lit match from an arsonist's hand. He saw the woman who had brought the law, the truth, and a dozen angry men to his doorstep to defend their home. He looked at her as if he were a man dying of thirst in the desert, and she was the first, clean, impossible light of dawn after a long and terrible drought. The external war was over. Deacon Rourke was a broken man, his empire of paper and fear about to crumble. The town's judgment was a cloud of smoke, already dissipating on the wind. But as he looked at his wife, standing proud and fierce in the wreckage, he knew there was one thing left, one final, unspoken truth that had been forged in the fire, one last, crucial acknowledgement that had to be made between them. Now that the world had finally been put right, the exodus happened before the sun. Judge Miller, his face grim but his eyes holding a new, hard respect, took charge of Rourke and his men, the deputy, now with the assistance of the Miller boys who were deputized on the spot, bound the prisoners' hands and led them away. A sorry, shuffling procession into the pre-dawn gloom. The other ranchers, their purpose served, mounted their horses. They didn't offer congratulations or engage in loud talk. They simply tipped their hats, one by one, first to Ezra, and then, with a profound and solemn deference, to Cora. It was a silent, communal apology from the town, an acknowledgement of their misjudgment, and a salute to the woman who had reminded them what it meant to fight for one's own. They left, their hoofbeats fading, until Dry Lantern Ridge was quiet once more. The silence they left behind was not empty. It was vast and clean and resonant. Dawn broke over the juniper flats, not as a fire, but as a soft, blushing watercolor. A low-lying mist clung to the hollows, a delicate silver veil that softened the hard edges of the land. The air was cool and tasted of wet earth and clean, cold stone. The sky bled from pale rose into the impossible, liquid blue of a new day. Cora stood on the porch, a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a mug of hot coffee warming her hands. She looked out at their land. The yard was a mess of tracks, a testament to the night's battle. The side of the barn was a black, ugly scorch mark, a scar that would always tell the story. But beyond that, the pasture was serene, the grass a deep, living green after the rain. The small herd of cattle, brought back from Jedediah's at first light, was grazing peacefully. The world was whole again. They had won. She should have felt triumphant. She should have felt a fierce, burning pride. And she did, in a way. But beneath the relief, a deeper, colder current still flowed. It was the old, familiar chill of doubt, the last ghost that refused to be exorcised. She had fought. She had stood her ground. She had been his partner. But the battle was over now. The immediate, desperate need for her strength, for her clear-headed fury, was gone. And in the quiet, peaceful aftermath, the old question returned, whispering in the lonely corners of her mind. What now? What are you, now that the war is over? Ezra came to stand beside her, his own mug in his hand. He didn't speak, just stood there, sharing the quiet, watching the sun climb, the stitches in his shoulder pulled tight, a constant, dull ache. But he stood straight. The silence was comfortable, easy, the way it had become between them. But for Cora, it was a space for the whisper to grow louder. She looked out at the land they had saved, at the home they had defended. It was his. He had built it, bled for it. He was a man of the earth, solitary and self-sufficient. He had survived alone for years. He knew how to be alone. She, on the other hand, was a creature of chaos, a stray pulled from a storm. The storm was over. Did the stray still have a place? She turned her head, looking at his strong, quiet profile against the morning light. The words came out before she could stop them, a soft, fearful breath of steam in the cool air. Ezra. He didn't turn, his gaze still on the horizon. She swallowed, her throat tight. This was the last, most vulnerable piece of herself, the final, deepest root of her fear. Last night, it was a fight. We were partners. I knew my place. I knew what I had to do. She paused, gathering her courage. But now, in the quiet, what if that's all I was? He finally turned to look at her. His brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" The question tumbled out, the one that had haunted her from the moment he had first shown her an impossible kindness. What if I was just a distraction, a way to fill the silence? You were lonely. I know you were. And I came along. A problem to solve. A battle to fight. It gave you purpose. But the fight's over. What if, now that it's quiet again? What if I'm just in the way? What if you look at me one day and all you see is the trouble I brought to your door? She looked down into her coffee cup, unable to bear the expression on his face. She was asking him to confirm her deepest, most profound fear that she was, and always would be, fundamentally unworthy of peace. He did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, and with every passing second, Cora's heart sank, but he was not silent because he was considering her words. He was silent because he was choosing his. He took the coffee mug from her unresisting hands and set it, along with his own, on the porch railing. Then he took her hands in his. His were large and warm and calloused, and they enveloped hers completely. He did not rush. He waited until she finally, hesitantly, lifted her head and met his gaze. His eyes were clear and steady, and they held the same solemn, quiet reverence she had seen in the firelight. "Cora," he said, his voice low and certain, a bedrock of truth in the quiet morning. "When you first came here, this place was silent, and yes, I was lonely. But the silence in this house wasn't peace. It was just emptiness. It was the sound of a life waiting. A distraction is something that pulls you away from your path, something that makes you lose your way." He took a small step closer, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were looking directly into her soul. "You," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, powerful whisper, "are not a distraction. Cora, you are not the thing that pulled me off my path." He paused, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "You are the path. You are the direction." The words, they were not poetic. They were not flowery. They were Ezra's words, practical, navigational, absolute, and they were the most beautiful words she had ever heard. They did not just answer her question. They redrew her entire map. She was not a detour. She was the destination. The tears that filled her eyes were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a final, cleansing release. The last ghost was gone, banished by the simple, undeniable truth in his eyes. He lifted his hand and cupped her face, his thumb brushing away the first tear that escaped, and then he kissed her. He kissed her there, in the bright, clean light of morning, with the scent of wet grass and the warm, living smell of the horses drifting up from the corral. It was a deep and certain kiss, a kiss that held no questions and left no room for doubt. It was the kiss of a man who had found his true north. It was a promise, a commitment, a final, unbreachable wall against all the whispers and all the fears of the world. It was the kiss of a man who was finally and completely home. When they finally broke apart, the sun was fully above the ridge, flooding the yard with a warm, golden light. From the porch, tied to a post, the heavy iron cowbell she had used as an alarm swung gently in the breeze, its clapper making a soft, intermittent clink, clank. It was not an alarm anymore. It was a call, the sound of a life, waiting for them, inviting them to step forward and begin. Cora looked up at him, and for the first time her smile was completely, utterly free of shadow. Her eyes, which had for so long held the look of the hunted, were now filled with a calm, shining light. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers lacing together behind his head, and pulled him down to her.
"Let me do this every day,"
she whispered, her voice thick with emotion but strong with purpose. "Let me make your house into our house." Ezra nodded, a slow, solemn movement. He rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes for a moment, a man absorbing a profound and welcome truth. "And I," he said, his voice a raw, unbreakable vow. Will keep you in peace, by any righteous means necessary. He was her direction, and she was his peace. They stood there for a long time, two figures on a simple wooden porch, the morning wind gently lifting the hem of her dress. They were not heroes. They were just two solitary people who had fought the world and their own ghosts and had, against all odds, found a home in each other. The vast, unforgiving landscape of the Juniper Flats stretched out before them. No longer a threat, but a promise, a future, a life, waiting to be lived together. Thank you for listening to this story. I'm curious, where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.